Welcome to Cosmic Wand. Today's adventure. Harry found a room where 1 hour was 10 years and walked out unbeatable before first class. If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Hidden Door. Harry Potter lay awake in a four-poster bed in a tower he had not known existed 12 hours earlier and listened to a castle breathe. The other first-year boys had gone down into sleep one by one, like candles pinched out along a hall. Ron Weasley snored in the next bed with the wholehearted commitment of someone who had eaten 3 desserts. Somewhere below, the common room fire had collapsed into embers. He could hear it settle, a soft ticking of cooling stone. Beyond the curtains, the dormitory windows held a sky so thick with stars that Harry, who had spent 10 years sleeping in a cupboard under a staircase, kept opening his eyes to check the stars were still there. That was not what kept him awake. What kept him awake was the breathing. He had noticed it during the feast and dismissed it as nerves. He had noticed it again climbing the moving staircases and dismissed it as the staircases themselves, which groaned and swung and rearranged their own logic while you stood on them. But now, lying still in the dark with nothing to do but notice, he could not pretend any longer. The castle made a sound, not the wind, not the pipes, not the 100 small noises of an old building cooling at night. Underneath all of that ran a slow, even cycle, a drawing in and a letting out, and it did not match the wind, and it did not match his own pulse, and once he had heard it, he could not stop hearing it. In and out, with a hitch in it, a flaw in the rhythm like a man favoring a hurt rib. Harry sat up. He was a thin boy with a thin boy's caution, and 10 years in the Dursleys' house had taught him that the safest thing to do with a strange noise was to lie still and let it pass. But it was not passing. It had been there since the Sorting Hat had finished shouting houses, and a part of his mind, the part that had spent a decade with nothing to read but cereal boxes and Dudley's discarded comics, the part that had taught itself to take everything apart to see how it worked, had begun very quietly to itch. A castle did not breathe, so either he was imagining it, which he could test, or something inside the castle was making a sound that resembled breathing, which he could find. Both were better than lying in the dark inventing reasons to be afraid. He pushed the curtains aside. The dormitory was full of the warm dark of sleeping boys. His glasses were on the nightstand. He put them on, and the room resolved into edges. His trunk sat at the foot of the bed, still mostly packed, the lid not yet learning to stay shut. His wand lay on top of his folded robes where he'd set it down. 11 inches of holly with a core he'd been told came from a phoenix. He picked it up. It was warm, the way a thing is warm when it has been held against the body all day, and the warmth steadied him more than he expected a stick to be able to. He dressed without a sound. Trousers, jumper, the school shoes that still smelled of the shop. He did not take a cloak. He did not own a cloak worth taking. He took the wand because leaving it felt like leaving a hand behind, and he took a stub of candle and a box of the long matches from his trunk because he did not yet trust himself to make light any other way. At the dormitory door he stopped and listened, in and out with the hitch. The sound did not come from any one direction so much as it came from below, from under the floor, under the tower, under the whole great weight of the school. Harry went down the spiral stair into the common room with his shoes in his hand. The fire was dead. The room held that particular emptiness of a place that is usually full, chairs pushed at angles by people who had risen and gone to bed, a chessboard abandoned mid-massacre, a single sock. The portrait of the fat lady was a darker rectangle on the wall, and as he crossed toward it her painted breath stirred. She was asleep too, or pretending, and Harry froze, but she only muttered and turned her painted head and the frame went still. He could not get out through her without waking her. He knew that already, but he had not come down to leave the tower. He had come down to follow the sound, and the sound did not lead to the portrait hole. It led to the far corner, past the notice board, to a stretch of stone wall where the firelight never reached and where by daylight there was nothing at all. Harry put his hand flat against the cold stone and felt the castle breathe out. It was not a draft. A draft moves in one direction. This moved both, a pressure that rose against his palm and then drew back from it, patient as tide. He held still and counted. 4 seconds out. A pause. 5 seconds in. The hitch fell on the in-breath, a small catch like a stuck gear, every cycle exactly the same, regular, mechanical. Harry had been afraid of a great many things in his life: his uncle's hands, the cupboard dark, the moment at the zoo when the glass had vanished and the snake had looked at him with what he could have sworn was gratitude, and he had learned that fear was information and not instruction. It told you something was there. It did not tell you to run. He was not afraid now, or not only afraid. He was, for the first time since the owls had come, genuinely curious, and curiosity in Harry ran deeper and older than fear. He lit the candle. The match flared, the wick caught, and the wall in front of him stopped being a wall. It did not open, nothing so dramatic. It simply became clear in the candlelight that what he had taken for solid stone was a seam, a thread of deeper black running floor to ceiling, too straight to be a crack, with a twin a yard to the left, a door's width apart. Between them the stone was smoother than the stone around it, worn the way a much-used threshold is worn by feet that had crossed it 10,000 times and then at some point stopped. There was no handle, there was no keyhole. There was, when he lifted the candle higher, a single mark cut into the stone at the height of his eyes, a circle, and inside the circle a smaller circle set off-center, like a moon caught halfway across the sun. Around the outer ring ran a line of characters he could not read, worn nearly smooth, more suggestion than letter. Harry looked at the mark for a long moment. Then he did the obvious thing, which was the thing nobody clever ever did in the stories because it would end the story too quickly. He pressed his palm to the circle and said, "Open." Nothing happened. He had not expected anything to. He tried Latin, the few words of it he'd absorbed from the spell list in his charms text, and got nothing. He tried pushing, and the wall was a wall. Tried his name, which was foolish, and the foolishness of it made him feel better, because a boy doing foolish things in the dark was just a boy and not someone a castle was breathing at. Then he stopped trying to make the door do something and started paying attention to what it was already doing. The breath came from the seam. He held his fingers a hair's width from the black line and felt the air move across them, out and then in with the hitch. Whatever lay behind the door was not sealed, it was venting. And a thing that vents has a way in and a way out, and the way in is rarely the front, because the front is for show. Harry crouched and put the candle to the floor. The worn threshold ran under the seam and a little way out into the common room, and then he traced it with a fingertip. It bent. The wear in the stone did not stop at the door. It turned left along the base of the wall toward the dark corner where the notice board hung, and there, behind a tapestry so old its hunting scene had faded to a green blur, the floor was worn again. A path, not to the door but around it. He lifted the tapestry. Behind it the wall was the same smooth stone, but lower down at a child's height, at the height of someone crouching. There was a gap where two blocks did not quite meet, and through the gap came the breath, stronger here, and with it the gray edge of a light that was not his candles. Harry set the candle down. He looked once back over his shoulder at the sleeping common room, at the dead fire and the abandoned chess and the dark rectangle of the fat lady's frame. Then he blew the candle out because the gray light was enough to see by, and that by itself should have stopped him, a light with no source, leaking from a gap in a wall at 1 o'clock in the morning in a castle that breathed, and he got down on his hands and knees and went through. The gap was longer than it looked. For 3 feet it was simply a crawl space, his shoulders brushing stone on both sides, the air growing cooler and the gray light growing nearer, and then the stone fell away on every side at once and Harry came out on his hands and knees into the room. He stood up slowly and forgot for a moment how to breathe in time with anything. The chamber was round. He could tell that much at once, though the walls were so far off and the light so even that distance had a way of sliding. It was the size of the great hall and then larger, and it had no corners and no shadows, because the gray light came from everywhere and nowhere, from the air itself, a soft, sourceless luminance the color of the sky a half hour before a snowfall. There were no windows, there was no fire, no torch, no glowing crystal, no enchanted ceiling. There was only the light, and it did not flicker. The floor was stone, fitted in a spiral of pale blocks that wound inward from the wall to the center, and at the center stood the only object in the room. It was a pillar of gray stone, waist-high, flat-topped like a broad sundial, and set into the flat top was a disk of darker stone that overlapped a disk of paler stone off-center, a circle within a circle, the same mark that had been cut over the door. Around the rim ran the same worn line of characters. The pale disk was carved with the slow, concentric rings of a tree's heart. The dark disk had nothing on it at all. It was simply perfectly black, and looking at it too long made Harry's eyes water, as if he were trying to focus on something that was not at any distance his eyes could reach. The breath of the castle was loud in here, in and out with the hitch, and now he could see what made the hitch, because every time the room breathed in, the dark disk on the pillar turned, not far. A fraction of a degree, a tiny patient rotation, and on the in-breath it caught, the way a clock's hand catches between teeth and then released and turned again. It was a clock, or it was the thing clocks were invented to imitate and never could. Harry crossed the spiral floor toward it, and as he crossed it, the silence changed. He noticed it the way you notice a sound stopping, a fridge you didn't know was humming, a fan in another room, except that nothing had stopped. Something had started just below hearing, and he understood after a few steps that it was his own footsteps arriving late. He brought his shoe down, and the sound of it reached him a beat behind, soft, like an echo with no wall to bounce from. He stopped. The sound stopped a fraction after he did. He waved his hand in front of his face, and the air dragged at it very slightly like water, and his fingers seemed to leave faint pale trails that vanished as soon as he looked straight at them. He was a boy who had taught himself everything he knew by treating the world as a thing with rules he had not yet been told. He stood at the foot of the breathing pillar and he did not touch it. Instead he reached into his pocket, took out a single long match, struck it on the box and let it fall. He counted. The flame fell. It did not fall the way a dropped match falls, which is to say fast, too fast to time, a flick of light and then the floor. It fell the way a thing falls in a dream, or underwater, or in the half-second a body grants you when it thinks you might be dying. It drifted. The little flame lined and guttered and trailed a thread of smoke that hung in the air behind it like a drawn pencil line, and Harry counted 1, 2, 3, 4, and at 4 the match touched the stone and the flame lay down and went out. 4 seconds, to fall the length of his own arm. Harry stood very still. His heart was going hard, but his mind had gone cold and clear and fast, the way it always had when there was a problem in front of him worth the having. A match falls a yard in less than half a second. He knew that. He dropped enough of Dudley's things from the top of the stairs to know exactly how fast a thing fell. This match had taken 4. Time in this room did not run the way it ran outside. It ran slow. No, he corrected himself because the correction mattered, because everything would turn on getting this exactly right. Time in here did not run slow. Time in here ran fast. He was inside the fast clock, and from inside a fast clock the rest of the world looks slow, looks underwater, drops its matches like falling leaves. He needed to test it. He needed a clock on each side of the wall, and he did not have a clock, and so he did the next best thing, which was to make himself the clock and measure the world. Harry sat down on the cool stone floor with his back to the pillar, and he waited and he counted his breaths. It was the longest hour of his life, and he meant to make it count. He told himself the times tables, because they were the one piece of mathematics the Dursleys' indifference had let him keep, and he ran them up to the 19s, and could not remember whether 19 sevens was 133 or 123, and resolved to learn it properly someday. He recited the names of the planets. He recited from the back of his charms textbook the wand movement for the levitation charm, swish and flick, and traced it in the air and watched his wand tip leave its trailing ghost. He grew bored, and then he grew calm, and then he grew so deeply, restfully bored that he understood he could sit here for a very long time without anything happening to him, which was itself a piece of data. The room did not hurt him. It did not get cold. He was not hungry, though he should by now have been hungry. The air stayed sweet, the gray light did not change, and the dark disk on the pillar turned and caught and turned a degree at a time, patient as a thing that has all the time there is. When he judged that something near an hour had passed, when his legs had gone stiff and his eyes had grown heavy and his count had wandered and recovered a dozen times, Harry got up and went back the way he had come, on his hands and knees through the crawlspace, out under the faded tapestry into the common room of Gryffindor Tower. The candle stub lay where he had left it. The chess set sat mid-massacre. The fire was dead. And by the window on the wall, the great brass and glass face of the common room clock said it was 11 minutes past 1 in the morning. Harry stared at it. He had gone down the spiral stair at 1. He had spent, he was certain of this, he had counted, he had felt every minute of it, the better part of an hour sitting on a stone floor reciting his times tables to a clock made of dark. 11 minutes. He went back through the gap. He did it carefully because carefulness was the only tool he trusted, and he wanted to be sure. He marked the time in his head, 11 past 1, the long hand a finger's width past the 12, and he crawled back into the gray light, and he sat down by the pillar, and this time he did not waste the hour on times tables. This time he opened his charms book, which he had thought to bring, and he read. He read the whole of the first chapter, which was on the theory of the swish and flick and the surprisingly involved history of people who had got it wrong. He read it twice. He practiced the wand movement until his wrist ached, and then until it stopped aching and the motion came without his thinking about it. Swish and flick, the wand leaving its pale trailing ghost. He pointed it at the dead match on the floor and said Wingardium Leviosa, and nothing happened because he was 11 and had been a wizard for a month, but he said it 100 times, 200, listening to the shape of the word in his mouth, the long second syllable, the lift on the gar. He read the second chapter. He grew tired and lay down on the warm. It had become warm where he sat, the stone taking his heat and keeping it, and he rested, and he did not sleep because the room did not seem to want him to sleep, and when he was rested he sat up and read the third chapter. By the time his eyes would no longer focus on the page, he judged that 3 hours had passed, perhaps 4. He had read 40 pages, practiced one charm into his bones, and let his mind run loose over the strangeness of the place until the strangeness had a shape. He crawled out, the candle stub, the chess set, the dead fire, and the clock on the wall, 23 minutes past 1 in the morning, 12 minutes for 4 hours. Harry sat down on the nearest sofa in the dark in the sleeping tower and made himself do the arithmetic slowly because his hands had begun to shake and he did not entirely trust a shaking boy's sums. 4 hours inside, 12 minutes outside. 4 hours was 240 minutes. 240 divided by 12 was 20 to 1. But the first test had been an hour inside for 11 minutes out, nearer to 5.5 to 1, and the numbers did not agree, and a younger Harry, a more frightened Harry, would have stopped there and called the whole thing a dream and gone to bed. This Harry frowned at the disagreement, because disagreement in numbers meant he had measured something wrong, and the most likely thing he had measured wrong was himself. He had no clock inside the room. He had only his own sense of time, and his own sense of time was a child's sense of time, which stretched in boredom and shrank in interest. The first hour he had spent bored reciting tables. It had felt like an hour and had probably been less. The 4 hours he had spent reading had flown. They had probably been more. The room kept perfect time. He did not. That was the lesson, and it was a useful one, and it told him the very first thing he would need if he meant to use this place. He would have to learn to measure the hour from the inside, exactly, or the room would lie to him about how much of his life he was spending in it. He did not have the true number yet. He would get it now properly while the tower slept and no one wanted him. He went back through the gap a third time, and this time he brought a method. The problem was that he had no clock to take inside, and his own sense of time was a liar. But the room had a clock, the disc on the pillar, turning a degree at a time, catching on the in-breath, releasing. If the disc kept its own perfect time, then the disc was a ruler he could lay against the hour, and all he had to do was learn to read it. He sat at the pillar and watched the dark disc turn and counted his own heartbeats between one catch and the next. It was not easy. His pulse ran fast at first with the strangeness of the place, and then it slowed as he calmed, and a thing that uses a changing ruler to measure a changing thing learns nothing. So he did what he always did when his tools were bad. He used a great many of them and averaged. He counted heartbeats across 10 catches and then across 10 more, and he held the numbers in his head and shaved off the high ones and the low ones, and what he was left with was steady. The disc caught at an even interval. Whatever else changed in this room, the clock at its heart did not. It was the one honest thing in here, and Harry loved it a little for that, the way he had loved the times tables, because it would not lie to him even when everything else might. Then he tested the thing he was most afraid was true. He took his second match. He had 3 left, and he did not drop it at the center this time. He dropped it at the very edge of the room, with his back against the curved wall, as far from the pillar as he could get. He counted. The match fell slowly, dreamily, but not as slowly as the first one had, 2.5 before it touched the stone. Then he walked to the pillar, to the dead center, and dropped his last match there and counted, and at the center the match took 5, twice as slow at the heart as at the wall, so the room was not one room, it was a slope. Time ran fast everywhere inside, but it ran fastest at the center, where the disc turned, and it shallowed toward the walls, and a person standing at the edge lived at one rate, and a person sitting at the pillar lived at another, faster one, deeper into the difference, further from the world. It was a pool exactly as he'd guessed, and the pillar was the deep end, and Harry understood without being told that if he wanted to spend the most time for the least cost to the clock outside, he would sit at the center, and that the center was therefore the most dangerous place to sit, because the deepest water is always where people drown. He held that thought and kept looking at it, because it was the most important thing he had learned tonight, and he did not want it sliding into the comfortable dark with the rest of a tired boy's thoughts. The center was the best place and the worst place, both at once. He would have to decide, every time he came here, how deep into the difference he was willing to go. That was when he found the mark. He had been sitting at the foot of the pillar, and as he shifted his weight, his hand came down on the stone of the floor, and the stone was wrong. Not cold wrong or warm wrong, worn. There was a patch of the pale spiral floor an arm's length across where the carved rings had been rubbed smooth and shallow, the way a step is worn, the way the threshold at the door was worn by a body that had sat in this exact place, at the center in the deep water again and again for long enough to grind the pattern out of solid stone. Someone had sat here, where he was sitting, for a very long time. Harry went cold, and then he went still, and then, because being afraid was information and not instruction, he leaned down and put his face close to the worn place and looked. At the edge of the smooth patch, where the wear thinned and the carving began again, someone had scratched a mark into the stone with something harder than a fingernail. It was a single short line, a tally, the kind a prisoner cuts to count days, and beside it faint, the ghosts of others, a row of them scratched and then half polished away by the same patient grinding that had worn the floor. He counted what he could see. He lost count. There were more than he could count, and then the wear took them, and the row of marks simply stopped being marks and became smooth stone, as if at some point the one who was counting had run out of room, or run out of reasons, or run out. Harry sat back. He had been telling himself a story all night, and the story was that he had discovered something, that he was the clever boy who had heard the castle breathe and followed the sound and found the secret room. It was a good story and a flattering one, and he saw now, kneeling over a dead man's tally, exactly how much of it was true. He had not discovered the room. The room had been discovered. It had been used by someone with the patience to grind stone smooth with the simple fact of sitting still, and that someone had counted their time here so carefully that they had carved the count into the floor, and then that someone had stopped. People who keep careful count do not stop counting because they are happy. He did not have the true number yet, but he could already see the shape of it, and the shape of it was enormous, and now he knew he was not the first to see it. Say, for the sake of seeing it, that it was 1,000 to 1. An hour outside would be 1,000 hours within 6 weeks. A single night, 8 hours of a tower full of sleeping boys would be 8,000 hours, near to a year. He could go to bed every night and rise every morning and in between live a year that no one would ever see, learn what a year teaches, and walk down to breakfast having aged 8 hours with the night's dark still under his eyes, and if it was steeper than that. If at the center where the disk turned it ran 10,000 to 1, 100,000. Harry Potter sat in the dark of a borrowed tower, an orphan in clothes too big for him, with a wand he had owned for 30 days and a head full of nothing but cereal boxes and a single charm he could not yet cast, and he understood with the total and frightening clarity that came to him sometimes when no one else he had ever met would have understood at all, that he had found a door behind which a person could become anything, given time. And time was the one thing the room had decided, for reasons of its own, to give away. He should have been overjoyed. Some part of him was already 11 years old and grinning in the dark at the size of it. But the larger part of him had gone still and careful, because he had also learned in 10 years under the stairs that the world did not give things away. The world gave you a thing and then it took two things in return, and it did this so smoothly that by the time you noticed, you had already agreed. A room that handed out lifetimes was not a gift. A gift had a giver, and the giver wanted something, and Harry meant to know what it wanted before he spent so much as another hour inside. He got up off the sofa. His legs ached as if he'd walked all day, though by the tower's clock he had been awake 40 minutes. He went to the gap behind the tapestry and crouched, and he did not go through. He looked at the gray light leaking out of it, soft and even and patient, and he asked the question he would spend the rest of the year answering. "What do you take?" the room breathed out, in and out with the hitch. It did not answer because rooms do not answer, but the breath touched his face, cool and sweet, and Harry was struck by the conviction, unprovable, unfalsifiable, the kind of thing he distrusted in himself, and noticed anyway that the room had heard the question, that it was the right question, and that it was pleased he had thought to ask it. He let the tapestry fall. He would not go in again tonight. That was discipline, and discipline was the only thing he had ever been able to count on, because it came from inside where the Dursleys couldn't reach it. He would go in again and soon, but first he would prepare. He would bring food and a way to keep time and his other books, and he would treat this the way he had taught himself to treat everything, as a system with rules that would reward the patient and punish the greedy, and he had no intention at all of being greedy. He would be the most patient boy who had ever lived. He had, after all, just discovered that he could afford to be. He climbed the spiral stair. He undressed in the warm dark of the dormitory and put his wand back on his folded robes and climbed into the four-poster bed that was the first bed he had ever owned and lay looking up at the canopy. Below him, through the floor, through the stone, through the deep foundations of the school, the castle breathed, in and out with the hitch. Now that he knew what it was, it did not keep him awake. It was only the sound of a clock he had found, turning a degree at a time, patient as a thing that has all the time there is, waiting for him to come back and begin. He had one last thought before sleep took him, and it was not the thought of a frightened boy, and it was not quite the thought of a child at all. Tomorrow he had his first lesson, Charms, at 9, with the tiny professor who toppled off his stack of books at the sound of Harry's name. He would walk in able to cast one spell badly. He would have to learn to lose before he had finished learning to win. That was a strange thing to know on your first night at a school, lying in your first bed, 11 years old, with the whole impossible building breathing under you like something asleep that had only been waiting for someone clever enough to wake. Harry smiled at the canopy in the dark and matched his breathing to the castle's, and for the first time in his life he fell asleep in a place he was not afraid of. He woke before the others, the way he always did, in the gray hour when the dormitory was full of the slow breathing of boys who had nowhere to be. For a moment he did not know where he was. Then he did, and the knowing came with the disk, turning in the dark below him, and he lay still and made his plan the way he made all his plans, from the end backward to the beginning. He wanted 3 things before he went through the gap again, and he wanted them to be invisible. He wanted food because the room did not feed you and 4 hours had left him hollow. He wanted a way to carry water, and he wanted more than either a clock, not the room's clock, his own. Something he could take inside and lay against the disk and use to nail the ratio down to a number he could trust his life to, because he had already decided, lying there, that he would be trusting his life to it. He got the food at breakfast, and it was the easiest theft he had ever committed, because it was not a theft at all. The great hall in the morning was a wide, warm clatter of 400 children, and a long table groaning with more than any of them could eat, and a thin boy filling his pockets with bread rolls and hard cheese, and a couple of apples was a thin boy who had been hungry once, and could not yet believe in a place where food came back every morning whether you saved it or not. No one looked twice. Ron, across the table, looked exactly once at the apples, and Harry gave him one, and that bought a friendship cheaper than anything Harry had ever bought. The water he solved with an empty ink bottle, rinsed and filled at the tower's washroom tap, and the clock he solved by accident, which was the only way he ever solved the things that mattered most. A boy 2 seats down at breakfast had a pocket watch, a fat scuffed silver thing on a chain, and he was complaining loudly that it had stopped, that his gran had given it him and it had stopped on the train and would not start, and would anyone like to buy a watch that didn't work? Harry would. Harry traded him a chocolate frog and the promise of 2 more, and the boy, delighted to be rid of a useless heirloom, shook on it before he could reconsider. A watch that did not work was, for Harry's purposes, very nearly as good as one that did, and in one respect better. He did not need it to tell the time outside. He needed it to count the time inside evenly against the disc, and a stopped watch with a sweep hand he could turn by the stem was a thing he could set running at the moment he stepped in and read at the moment he stepped out, and compare the two and learn the truth. He wound it in the washroom with the door bolted, and the mechanism caught, rusty, reluctant, and then began to tick, and Harry watched the thin hand sweep and felt something in his chest sweep with it. He thought, standing there with a dead man's watch ticking in his palm, about the tally on the floor, about the marks that stopped. He was not a boy who believed in luck, good or bad, because luck was the name people gave to the rules they hadn't bothered to learn, and he meant to learn every rule this place had before it learned him. The one who had sat where he meant to sit had kept careful count and had stopped. Harry would keep careful count too. But he would also keep count of the count. He would watch himself for the changes the room might work on him, the small thefts a patient thing makes from a patient guest, and the first time he could not account for a missing piece of himself, he would walk out and not come back, however much he wanted to stay. That was the rule he made himself the morning of his first day, and it was the only rule that mattered, and he would break it, eventually, the way everyone breaks the one rule that matters, but he did not know that yet, and so he made it cleanly and meant it. The bell rang for the start of lessons somewhere far off in the warm stone. Harry put the ticking watch in one pocket and the bread in the other and went down through the sleeping common room while the rest of his year were still pulling on their robes, and he crouched at the gap behind the faded green tapestry, and the gray light touched his face, and the room breathed out to meet him. He had a charm to learn before 9 o'clock. He intended to learn it perfectly, and then to walk into a bright classroom and get it wrong, and no one in the whole breathing castle would have the first idea what it had cost him to fail so convincingly. He set the watch running and went in. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The first decade the watch read 4 minutes when Harry decided he would spend 10 years. He had set it running at the gap and carried it to the pillar, and there he sat with it flat on the worn stone where a dead man had sat before him, and he watched 2 clocks at once. The first was the silver sweep hand ticking out his own honest seconds. The second was the dark disc on the pillar, catching and turning on the room's slow in breath. He counted the disc's catches against the watch's seconds for what the watch swore was a single minute, and when he had the number he held very still, because the number was the largest he had ever held, 876. The disc caught 876 times while the sweep hand crossed 1 honest minute of the world. He did not yet know what 1 catch of the disc was worth in lived time, so he found out the slow way, the only way he trusted. He chose a thing he could do at a known pace, the swish and flick of the levitation charm, which his wrist now performed in a beat he could feel like a pulse, and he made 1 full motion per catch, and he counted his own age in the doing of it. He did the charm until his arm ached and rested and did it again, and he kept the tally on the floor with a pebble he ground to a point, 1 scratch for every 1,000, and he lived inside that counting until the counting was a life. When the watch read 60 minutes, 1 hour of the world gone, he stopped, and he sat among the scratches he had made, and he was not 11 anymore in any way that mattered except the one that showed, 10 years to the hour. The disc had given him 10 years for 1 turn of the watch, and the watch did not lie, and the disc did not lie, and so the number was true. At the center of the room, in the deep water by the pillar, an hour outside was 10 years within. He understood, sitting there, exactly what he was holding, and he understood it the way you understand a cliff edge, not as an idea but as a place your body has arrived at. A boy who came here every night for an hour would live 10 years a night. A boy who stayed an afternoon would outlive his teachers. There was no skill in the world that 10 years would not buy a patient mind, and Harry had a patient mind, and now he had 10 years, and he had them again tomorrow, and the day after, and for as many days as he was careful enough to keep this door. He had stopped at 60 minutes by design. He had promised himself a single measured hour and no more, because the first rule of using a thing you do not understand is to use a little of it and then stop and look at what it did to you. So he stood on legs that remembered a decade of standing, and he took stock of Harry Potter. He was taller in his mind than in his body, which had not changed at all, still 11, still thin, still wearing the jumper he had pulled on in the dark, but his hands knew the wand now. His wrist had a decade in it. He could make the holly do the swish and flick without thought, 1,000 times rehearsed, and that was the smallest thing he had learned, the thing he had used merely to count by. In the spaces between the counting, he had read every page of every book he had carried in, and then read them again looking for the errors, and then sat in the gray light and argued with the dead authors until he understood not just what they said, but why they had been wrong about the parts they were wrong about. He had done all that in the corner of a single hour, and he had stopped on purpose with the rest of the hour unspent, because the point was never the power. The point was to find out what the power cost before he had spent so much of it that he could not afford to learn. So far it had cost him nothing he could find. That frightened him more than a price would have. He crawled out under the tapestry into the common room, and the watch in his pocket said it was 16 minutes past 7 in the morning, and the tower was beginning to wake. A second year came yawning down the stair, scratching, and did not see the boy crouched in the corner, and Harry watched her cross the room at what seemed to him an underwater drift, every motion of her too slow, the yawn going on and on like a tide coming in. It passed. His sense of time settled back toward the worlds. But for a moment he had seen her the way the room had taught him to see, and the world had been a slow place full of slow people, and he had not liked how easy it would be to start thinking of them that way for good. He ate one of his bread rolls sitting on the cold hearth, and he made his decision while he chewed, the way he made all his real decisions, without ceremony. He would spend a decade, not an hour, a decade, lived end to end, deliberately, the way you move into a house instead of touring it. 1 hour of the world bought 10 years. He had a free morning before his first lesson and a careless prefect who would not miss a first year at the back of the common room. He could afford an hour, and an hour was 10 years, and 10 years was enough to find out who Harry Potter became when nothing in the world could reach him and only the room could. If the room meant to take something for it, 10 years was long enough that the theft would show. He went back in. The room had been waiting, and the room, he discovered on the second day of his decade, could hear him. He had wished idly for a better book. He had exhausted his charms text and his transfiguration primer and the thin gray history he'd been assigned, and he sat at the pillar wishing aloud, the way a lonely person talks to a room, that he had Slinkard's advanced theory, the one the older students complained about, the one with the chapter on conjuration that everyone said was impossible to follow. He said the title out loud into the gray light, and on the floor at the edge of the worn patch where there had been nothing, there was a book. It was not Slinkard's. He knew that at once because he opened it, and the first page held a sentence he had been about to think, in handwriting he half recognized as a tidier version of his own. The book wrote itself as he read it. It answered the question he was holding, and then it answered the next one, the one the answer raised, and when he tried to catch it out, when he asked it something he was certain no one knew, the deep structure of why a levitation charm lifted against gravity without a reaction pushing down. It did not lie, and it did not invent. It said in his tidier hand, I don't know, and then it said, here's how you could find out, and it laid him a path of experiments, and he walked the path, and at the end of it he knew a thing that perhaps no living wizard knew, and the book had not taught it to him. It had only refused to let him stop. He spent the better part of the second year on a single one of those refusals, and it taught him more about the room than anything else that decade. He had asked the book whether a thing transfigured kept any memory of what it had been, whether a teacup that had once been a tortoise was, in some deep grammar, still a little bit tortoise, and the book had said, I don't know, no one knows, here's how you could find out, and had laid him a ladder of 200 experiments, each one built on the last. He climbed it across a year of graylit mornings, transfiguring and reverting and measuring, keeping his results scratched on the floor in a notation he invented because no existing one was fine enough, and at the top of the ladder he found the answer, and the answer was yes, faintly. A thing remembers what it was, and the remembering is the seam you can take it apart along, and that single discovered fact, won by a boy alone in a gray room over a year no one would ever count, was the seed of the unmaking knowledge he would one day keep walled in a roomless room, because a thing that remembers what it was can be persuaded to be it again or to be nothing, and a man who knows that knows how a great many things come apart. He had not been taught it, he had wanted it badly enough to find it. The room only ever gave him the wanting and the time, the finding was always his, and the finding was the only thing he ever fully owned. He understood the room a little better after that. It did not give you knowledge. The dead man's tally had told him that knowledge was not the kind of thing this place gave. It gave you time, and it gave you a mirror that asked questions, and it left the becoming to you. That was a crueler gift than a library, and a greater one, and Harry, who had taught himself everything he knew from the wrong side of a cupboard door, recognized the shape of it like a hand fitting a glove. He tested the room's edges before he trusted its center. That was discipline too. He learned that nothing made in the room would leave it. He conjured the book a twin, a copy in his own hand, and carried it to the gap, and the moment his fingers crossed into the crawl space, the copy thinned to gray light and was gone. He tried it with a pebble. He tried it with a strip torn from his own jumper, which was real, which he had brought in, and the strip came out because it had come from the world and belonged to it, but the ink he had marked it with in the gray light stayed behind, the letters lifting off the cloth as he crossed the threshold like breath off a cold window. Whatever the room sustained, the room kept. He could carry out his own clothes and his own watch and his own scars. He could not carry out so much as a word he had written in here. Only one thing left the room with him, and it left whole, and it left every time, and it was the only thing the room could not hold because it had never been the room's to hold. He could carry out what was in his head. The mastery came with him. The decade came with him, pressed into his hands and his eye, and the patterns his wand had learned, invisible, weightless, undetectable by any threshold. That was the whole secret of the door. It could not give you a sword you could show anyone. It could only make you one and send you out looking exactly like the boy who had walked in. He went back to the pillar and he began to build the sword in earnest. The figures came in the third year when he asked for them. He had drilled his wandwork until theory was the only thing left to drill, and theory without practice was a sword you never swung. He needed something to fight. He stood in the center of the room and he described what he wanted: an opponent, a thing that would cast back at him, that would hurt him enough to teach him and not enough to end him. And the gray light at the edge of the chamber thickened and stood up and became a man. It had no face. It was the color of the light, a person-shaped density in the air, and it held a wand-shaped absence in its hand. Harry raised his wand. The figure raised its own a fraction faster, and Harry knew in the half-second before the first spell that the fraction was deliberate, that the room had built him an opponent precisely as much better than himself as it took to teach, and that the fraction would shrink only as he did the shrinking. The first spell put him on his back. It came low and flat and faster than thought, a lance of pale force that took him under the ribs and folded him and flung him a body's length across the stone, and the breath went out of him in a sound he had not made since the cupboard, and a welt rose on his forearm like a brand where he had thrown the arm up too late. He lay on the cold floor with the gray light even and indifferent above him and his ears ringing, and the figure stood at the edge of the circle with its wand lowered, waiting, patient, not pressing the advantage, because the figure was not here to win. It was here to make him lose correctly. Harry lay there and laughed once, a cracked sound, because it had been a clean hit, an honest hit, and he had not had an honest opponent in 3 years of greylit solitude. Then he got up and set his feet and lost again, and again. He lost 1,000 times to the first figure, and the losing taught him what no book had, that the wand was the slowest part of a duel, that the spell was decided in the shoulders and the eyes a quarter-second before the word, that a man who watched your wand was already beaten, and a man who watched your weight could not be surprised. The day he first beat it, he remembered for 18 centuries afterward, because it was the day he learned that he could invent. He had lost 10,000 times by then, and he knew every spell the figure threw and every block it favored, and it still beat him, narrowly always, by the deliberate fraction, and he understood at last that he could not win by being better at the things the figure knew, because the figure knew them too and was, by design, a hair better. So he did a thing the books did not contain and the figure had never seen. He made the wrong block on purpose, opened a line he did not need to open, and when the figure's spell came through the gap he had baited it through, he was no longer standing in it. He had moved on the lie, walked his reel working through the opening the figure had committed to, and the pale shape staggered, struck for the first time. Gray light bleeding from a wound Harry had invented the shape of 1/2 second before it existed. He stood over the reeling figure with his heart going like a drum and felt a thing older than triumph, the specific joy of a mind that has finally found an edge sharp enough to cut on. And he understood that this, not the spells, not the theory, but the inventing, was the only thing the room could not give him and the only thing worth having, and he gave the rest of the decade to it. He climbed that ladder for years. The first figure stopped beating him in the 5th year, and the room gave him a second, faster, and he lost all over again from the bottom. By the 7th year he fought 3 at once and walked out of the circle untouched, his wand moving in patterns he had not been taught and had instead discovered, the way you discover a true thing, by needing it badly enough that your hand finds it before your mind does. He stopped naming the spells. The naming was a crutch for the young, a way of borrowing a dead wizard's certainty. He had certainty of his own now, 10 years of it, and the magic came when he wanted it to come and wore whatever shape the moment asked for, and the words, when he used them at all, were a courtesy to a tradition and not a key to a lock. He was, by any measure the world outside used, a master. He was also still 11 years old and would be when he stepped out, and he held both of those facts at once and did not let either one comfort him, because there was a third fact he had been tracking the whole time, and the third fact was the one that mattered. The room had begun, very quietly, to take its payment, and it had started with his mother. He noticed it in the 3rd year, and he noticed it because he had been watching for it, and a boy who watches for a theft sees it sooner than a boy who trusts the house. He had a habit, by then, of ending each year of training with an hour of stillness in which he walked through the few things he owned that the room could not give him. He owned almost nothing. He owned a scar. He owned the memory of a green light and a high cold laugh which the room never touched, which he came to understand the room could not touch, because it was not his to lose. It had been put in him by someone else, and it was anchored to something the room had no claim on. And he owned his mother's face. It was not much of a memory. He had been a year old. What he had was not a picture so much as a warmth with a shape to it, red hair and a particular green in the eyes that he had always privately believed was the same green as the killing light turned kind. He went to it every year at the end of his stillness to be sure it was still there. In the third year he reached for it and the green was wrong. He could not have said how it was wrong, it was still green. But the certainty had gone out of it, the way a word you have written too many times stops looking like a word. He sat very still and reached harder, and the harder he reached the further it went, like a coin sinking through deep water, and he made himself stop reaching, because he understood that the reaching was part of how it sank. He did the only experiment available to him, which was to test whether the loss was the room or merely time. Memories fade, a thing remembered at 1 year old will thin in any boy by his teens, room or no room. So he held the loss against the others. The green light was sharp as the day it had happened, sharper, the room had not thinned it at all. The faces of the Dursleys were exactly as vivid as he wished they were not. Ron's grin from the breakfast table 3 years of training ago, 1 outside hour ago, was bright and whole. Only the kind thing was sinking, only the warm thing. The room was not taking time from him evenly, the way years take from everyone. It was reaching into him and choosing, and it had chosen the gentlest thing he owned, and it had taken it so softly that a boy who was not watching would have called it growing up. Harry sat at the pillar in the grey light with 7 years still to spend, and he was, for the first time since he had found the door, afraid in a way that did not feel like curiosity. Then he did what he did with everything that frightened him. He took it apart. If the room took memory as payment, then memory was a currency, and currencies could be defended. He could not stop the theft. He tried that whole 4th year and found no lever for it, no spell, no discipline of will that the grey light could not slide past. But a thing you cannot stop you can sometimes outrun. He could not keep the room from spending his mother's face. He could spend it first, somewhere the room could not reach. He built himself a house, not of stone. He had read in the self-writing book, The Bones of an Old Discipline, the book called The Ordering of the Inner Room, a way of laying memory into a built place so that recall became a walk down a remembered hall. He took the discipline and he bent it to his need, which was not recall but refuge. He built it over the 5th and 6th years, and he built it the way a man with infinite time builds anything, which is slowly and well. It began as a single room and became a corridor and became a wing and became, by the end, a house so vast that walking its length in his mind took an hour of greylit attention, hall after hall of his own making, the architecture of a self deliberately constructed to be harder to rob. And in the deepest of those halls, the ones he hid behind false walls and dead ends and stairs that went nowhere, he carried the things he could not bear to lose, one at a time, and walled them in with his own hands. He remembered the night he walled his mother. He went to the warmth of the green, already thinning, already sinking, a coin 3 feet down in dark water, and he reached for it not with the grasping that made it sink, but with the slow, patient attention that had ground stone smooth. And he gathered it, all of it, every fading degree of the kindness, and he carried it down through the false halls to the deepest room in the house, the one with no door, the one he had built last and best. He laid the warmth in the center of that room. He looked at it for a long time, because looking was the mortar. And then he built the wall, brick by remembered brick, attention laid on attention until the room was sealed and the warmth was behind it, and the patient gray wind that reached through everything else in the house came to that wall and could not pass, because the wall was made of the one material the room had never learned to take, which was a thing looked at on purpose, hard and often, and chosen. It half worked, which was more than nothing. The room could still reach the things he left in the open. It could not reach what he had walled. He learned that way which parts of himself he could keep and the cost of keeping them, and the cost was that he had to know always exactly what he was carrying, because the inner house only protected what he had thought to wall, and the room took everything he forgot to. The price of the room was attention, paid forever, and a single lapse was a door left open, and behind every open door the grey light was patient, and it was reaching, and it did not choose at random. It chose the gentle thing. It always chose the gentle thing. He understood by the 6th year that this was not cruelty. The room was not cruel any more than a tide is cruel. It was built to take, and it took what was least defended, and the least defended things in any person are the soft ones, the warm ones, the ones held with love instead of vigilance. The room ran on tenderness. Somebody had built a machine that turned a person's gentlest memories into time, and Harry had walked into it on his first night at school and asked it, politely, what it would take, and it had told him, and he had not believed it until it took his mother. He stopped being afraid somewhere in the 7th year, not because the fear was wrong, but because he had work to do and fear was a poor coworker. He set it down where he could see it, and he kept going, because the alternative was to leave, and he was not ready to leave, and he was honest enough with himself to know that the not being ready was itself the first symptom of the disease the room gave everyone who found it. The dead man had not been ready either. The dead man had kept careful count and built whatever defenses a man builds and stayed too long, and his tally on the floor had stopped. Harry meant to be the one who stopped first. There was the matter of the food, which he had brought because in his first naive morning he had thought a body needed feeding, and which had taught him, by sitting uneaten, the deepest and worst thing he learned that decade. He had carried in bread and cheese and apples and the ink bottle of water enough for a day, because on his first day he had not yet understood the ratio and had imagined a long afternoon and not a decade. 10 years is a long time to go without eating. He had not eaten. He had not needed to. He had felt hunger as a far-off rumor, the way you feel weather in another country, and he had set the food aside on the second day and forgotten it. And when he remembered it in the fourth year and unwrapped it, the bread was soft and the apples were sound and the cheese had not so much as sweated. 10 years and the food had not aged a minute, because nothing in the room sustained aged at all. He was not aging. His body, when he stepped out, would be 11 years and 1 hour old. He had known that. He had counted on it. What he had not counted on was the question the unspoiled bread forced him to ask, which was, if his body did not age and did not eat and did not starve across 10 years of living, then what was keeping it alive? A body is an engine, and an engine burns fuel. He was thinking moving, bleeding, graylit blood when the figures cut him, and healing again by morning, and all of that was work, and work was fuel, and he had brought no fuel that the room had let him spend. So the fuel was coming from somewhere. The room was feeding him. And the room did not make things. The dead man's tally had taught him that, and the self-writing book had confirmed it. The room created nothing. It only moved things, time out of one account and into another, memory out of a boy and into the turning of a disc. It was not a furnace. It was a pipe. Whatever was keeping his body alive across 10 unfed years was not being made by the room. It was being moved from somewhere to him. He did not know that decade where the other end of the pipe was. He knew only that there was one, and that he was drinking from it, and that somewhere in the castle in the world, in some account he could not see, something was paying the bill for every breath he took in the gray light. The memory the room took from him was the fee, the small change, the toll at the gate. The life that kept him standing was drawn from somewhere else, and he was, whether he wished to be or not, spending it. He thought about the dead man's tally a great deal that year. He thought that perhaps the man had not died of the room at all. Perhaps the man had died of the pipe, of whatever was at the other end of it, running dry or running out or coming at last to collect. In the 10th year he cleaned the floor. It was a small enough thing to do with the last of a decade, and he had grown, across 10 years of solitude, into a person who finished what he started, and the worn patch by the pillar was a thing he had been not looking at for 10 years the way you do not look at a grave you pass every day. He had built his life on that patch. He had bled on it and slept on it and walled his mother's face away from a few feet above it. He owed the man who had worn it smooth at least the courtesy of reading what he had left. So Harry knelt in the last year of his first decade, and he cleaned the stone not with water, which the room would only have unmade, but with attention, with the patient graylit care of a person who had nothing but time, and had learned exactly what time was worth. He brushed the grit of a decade's training out of the old scratches. He laid his master's eyes against marks a frightened man had cut with a sharpened pebble, and he read. The tally ran to numbers that stopped Harry's breath. The man had counted by decades, as Harry had 10 years to a scratch, and the scratches marched away from the worn patch in a tight gray rank, and Harry counted them and lost count and counted again and made it, at the end, somewhere past 400 years. The man had sat where Harry sat and lived 400 years in the gray light, an hour at a time, a night at a time, and the tally did not end in a flourish or a final mark. It simply thinned. The scratches grew shallower and closer and less certain, the hand that cut them losing its decision, until the last of them was barely a graze on the stone, half a stroke, abandoned, as if the man had started to cut his 400-and-something decade and had forgotten part-way through what he was counting, or why a man counts anything, or that he was a man at all. And below the tally, where Harry had never thought to climb, cut deeper than the rest, cut first before the counting started, when the hand was still sure and the mind still knew its own name, was a word. A name. The man had signed himself on his first day before he understood, the way Harry had nearly carved his own name into a door on his first night and been saved from it only by feeling foolish. The name was worn, and Harry was not certain of all of it, and he would spend a long time afterward being unsure. But the first part was clear, cut deep and sure by a hand that had still, on that first day, believed it was going to be all right. It began with a B, and the room breathed in, and the disc caught and turned, and Harry knelt over a dead man's name with 10 years of mastery in his hands and the cold understanding at last that the door he had been found before and signed for, and paid out to the last gentle memory in the last unspoken decade, and that the man who had paid had not walked out. The tally proved it. A man who walks out stops counting because he is free. A man whose count thins to nothing and stops mid-stroke does not walk out. He is still in here. He had been in here the whole time, somewhere in the gray light Harry had called solitude, 400 years of him pressed into the walls, and the patience and the fraction of a second by which the first figure had always been faster than Harry wanted it to be. Harry stood up. He had come for a decade, and he had spent it, and he had what he had come for. He was, by every measure the world used, unbeatable, and he had 10 years to prove it, and a price he had only begun to map. It was enough. It was more than enough. A careful boy would step out now on schedule with a decade's mastery and his life intact and never come back and let the door close and grow up slow and human and safe. He stood over the name that began with a B, and he knew, with the same total clarity that had told him on the first night that he had found a door behind which a person could become anything, that he was not going to be a careful boy. Not because a decade wasn't enough to be unbeatable. Because a decade wasn't enough to be sure, and the man pressed into these walls had counted 400 years and still not been sure, and there was a pipe with an unknown thing at the other end of it that was paying for Harry's breath, and there was a name half-read on a stone, and Harry Potter had never in his life been able to walk away from a question while it was still a question. He would step out. He would check the watch and pay the title its due and see with his own eyes the world he had outgrown in a single hour. He would do that much carefully. And then he would come back and he would go deeper than a decade, because the only way out of a trap you do not understand is through the understanding, and the understanding was not in the world above. It was down here in the gray light, signed for in deep sure strokes by a man who had believed, on his first day, that he was going to be all right. Harry put his hand flat on the worn stone over the name the way you put a hand on a shoulder. "I'll find out what it took from you," he said, to the room, to the walls, to the 400 pressed-in years. "And I'll find out what it's taking from me, and then I'll decide whether to pay." The room breathed out, cool and sweet against his face, and Harry could not tell and would never be sure whether the breath was the house agreeing or only the tide coming in. He set the watch running, picked up his wand, and crawled toward the gray edge of the light, 11 years old, 1 hour from breakfast, and 10 years deep into a debt he had not yet learned the size of. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Walking out unbeatable, he came out of the gap a master, and the world had not moved. That was the thing that nearly broke him in the first instant, not the gulf in skill, which he had expected, but the gulf in motion. He had lived 10 years since he last drew breath in this common room, and the common room did not know it. The fire he had watched die was still dead in the same shape. The chessboard sat at the same massacre. The second year who had yawned her way down the stair an hour and a decade ago had not yet reached the portrait hole. She was still crossing the floor mid-step, her dressing gown still settling around the motion she had begun before Harry had aged out of childhood. To her, he had been gone the length of a held breath. To him, she was a statue the world had not finished carving. He checked the watch because checking was the discipline that had kept him sane, and the watch told him the truth the title had promised. 1 hour. He had been gone 1 hour of the world, and he had lived 10 years, and here was the proof of it in silver and glass, ticking on in his palm as if nothing at all had happened, which, to the watch, was correct. He sat down on the cold hearth among the dead fire's ashes and made himself breathe at the world's pace, because the alternative, the thing the room had taught him to do, which was to perceive at the speed of the gray light, turned the waking castle into a museum of slow people he could walk through untouched, and he had felt in the 7th year exactly how easy it would be to start thinking of them as furniture. The 2nd year reached the portrait hole. The fat lady's frame swung. The girl went out into the corridor, and the world ticked forward at its underwater crawl, and Harry sat very still and practiced being 11. He was good at it for about a minute. Then the certainty rose in him, cold and clear, that a decade was not enough. It was not arrogance. Arrogance was a thing for people who had not measured themselves, and Harry had measured himself against 3 figures at once and walked out of the circle untouched, and he knew exactly what he was. A master of the wand in a boy's body, with a price he had mapped and not paid the whole of. But the price was the point. He had a pipe running into him from somewhere he could not see, feeding a life he had not bought, and he had a name beginning with B cut deep into stone by a man who had stayed 400 years and not come out. And a master who understood as much as Harry now understood also that he was standing in the shallow end of a thing whose deep end had killed the only other person known to have found it. A decade had taught him the room's grammar. It had not taught him the room's purpose, or its maker, or where the pipe led, or whether the bill at the end of it had his name on it or someone else's. He could learn those things in the world above slowly over a human lifetime, a boy among boys, growing up at the world's crawl with a decade's secret mastery, and a price he did not understand ticking quietly underneath him until, some ordinary afternoon decades from now, it came due. Or he could go back down into the gray light and learn them the way he learned everything, by spending the only currency the room respected, which was time, and he had as much of it as he was willing to pay for. He had until 9 o'clock, charms with the tiny professor in a bright room full of children he would have to lose to. The watch said it was 7:30. He had 90 minutes of the world before he had to be a boy in a chair, and 90 minutes was he did the arithmetic without flinching, because flinching was for people who had not yet decided 90 minutes was 900 years. He would not spend all of it. He was not the dead man. He would spend what it took to get sure, and he would keep the watch on the stone in front of him the whole time, and he would walk out the instant the silver hand told him the boy was due in his chair. But he would go deep this time, past the decade. past anything a careful boy would dare. He stood and stretched a body that did not know it had ever been anything but 11 and went back through the gap into the gray light to become the thing the title had promised. He would walk out unbeatable, or he would not walk out a boy at all. There is no honest way to tell the next part at the pace it was lived, because it was lived at the pace of mountains, and a sentence is a thing that happens in a second. So here is the shape of it, which is all that can be carried out of a place like that. Across the long gray morning in the deep water by the pillar, Harry Potter lived lifetimes, and at the end of them he was no longer learning magic. He was magic, the way a river is water, and he had forgotten, chosen to forget, walled away the forgetting where even he could not reach it, what it had felt like to be a boy who could not do this. He spent the first century rederiving everything. He had mastered the wand, now he went underneath the wand, into the question the self-writing book had refused to answer on the second day, why a charm lifts against the weight of the world without anything pushing back, and he did not come up until he had it, and having it changed the way he held a wand, the way understanding the sea changes the way you hold an oar. He found the place where the named spells came from, the cold spring underneath the whole tradition, where intention met the world's deep grammar and the world, courteous, rearranged itself to agree. After that the names fell away entirely. He did not cast levitation, he asked the weight of a thing to be a suggestion, and it was. He did not cast fire, he reminded the air what it could become, and it remembered. He learned the unmaking under the making, the way a thing comes apart, which is the same knowledge as putting it together read backward, and he was careful with that knowledge and kept it in a deep room, because a man who knows how a thing comes apart knows how a person does, and that was a door in the inner house he meant never to open and never to forget he had shut. The figures, when he called them, came in ranks, faceless and faster than thought, and he unmade them out of the air with a turn of attention. And the room, which built each one a fraction better than the last, ran out of fractions, and built him opponents that were simply, honestly, as good as anything the world had ever produced, and he beat those too, and the room, at last, built him himself. It built him a figure with his own mind in it, his own decade and century of mastery, faceless and gray and exactly his equal, and it set the thing against him in the deep water, and for the first time since the third year Harry Potter could lose. He fought himself for 100 years. It was the only worthy fight left in the world, because it was the only opponent that could surprise him, being him, and it knew every edge he had ever found because it had found them too, and the duels went on for days of greylit time, two masters who shared a mind circling the pillar. The grey light tore and healed around them. He learned, fighting the thing that wore his face, that there is a level of skill at which a duel stops being a contest of spells and becomes a contest of selves, of who has imagined more of the future, who has walled away more fear, who wants the next half-second more. And at that level the only way to win was to become something his own mirror had not yet thought of, and so he did again and again, each victory a thing he invented in the half-second before it killed him. And each invention a thing the figure learned by the next dawn and turned back on him. He climbed past himself 100 times that century. He became, by the end of it, something that had no name in the tradition and no peer in the world and no opponent left in the room except the one the room could not build, which was the only one that frightened him, which was the Maker. So he turned in the 2nd century from the fighting to the finding, and he tried to take the room apart the way he took everything apart, and the room would not let him. This was the most important thing he learned in 1800 years, and it was a thing he learned by failing. He turned his whole accumulated mastery on the pillar, on the disc that kept the honest time, on the rim script worn nearly smooth, on the pipe he could feel now as a master feels a draft, the thin cold thread of borrowed life running into him from somewhere beyond the wall. He read the rim script in 40 scripts and found it was none of them, an older hand, a private hand, a maker writing for herself and no successor. He traced the pipe with his attention, and it ran true to the wall, and then it ran into the wall and through it and away, out of the room, out of the gray light, into the slow stone world above where his perception could not follow, anchored to something he could not see from in here, a thing in the castle or under it or woven into it, alive enough to pay a bill. He pressed on the disc with the unmaking knowledge, gently, a master testing a lock, and the room did not resist him so much as it declined to be there, the way a reflection declines to be grasped. The disc was the surface of something whose body was elsewhere, and you cannot dismantle a thing by attacking its shadow. The answer to the room was not in the room. He understood that with total certainty by the end of the 2nd century, and it was a bitter understanding, because it meant the one place his power could not buy him the truth was the one place he had spent 18 centuries to reach. The Maker had built her machine so that no amount of mastery earned inside it could turn against it. Whatever she had been at least as careful as Harry, and that was the most frightening fact he had yet found, more frightening than the gulf, because it meant the mind that had built his prison was a mind he could respect. And underneath all of it, the whole long ascent and the whole long failing, The price was being paid softly in the gentle coin, and Harry, who had walled away everything he could bear to lose, found in the deep water the thing about the inner house that the dead man had surely found too and gone mad over and stopped counting. The house was finite. He could only wall what he remembered to wall, and across lifetimes the things he forgot to defend were not only the small tendernesses he could spare. They were the load-bearing ones, the ones he did not know were load-bearing until they were gone. He lost the boy from the playground. He had not thought of him in 9 years, which was the room's whole patient cruelty. It could not take what you guarded, so it waited lifetimes if it had to, for the day you stopped guarding, and then it took. Before Hogwarts, before the letters, there had been one afternoon in the whole gray waste of his childhood when another child had been kind to him. A boy at the edge of the playground, smaller than Dudley's gang, who had shared half a melting ice lolly with the strange, thin Potter boy and asked him, with no cruelty at all, whether it was true he could make things happen. Harry had said no. The boy had said he believed him anyway, which was the kindest thing anyone had said to Harry in 10 years, and then the boy's mother had called him and he had gone, and Harry had never learned his name and had carried the afternoon like a coal ever since without ever once thinking to wall it, because how do you guard a thing so small you have forgotten you are holding it? In the 3rd century he reached for that afternoon, the way you reach without looking for a thing your hand expects to find, and his hand closed on nothing. The ice lolly was there, the mother's voice was there, calling. The boy was a hole. Not a face gone vague, a hole, an absence cut clean, the shape of a kindness with the kindness lifted out, and Harry stood at the pillar at the height of his power, able to unmake an army with a thought, and could not get back the one afternoon a stranger had been gentle to him, because he had spent it here on a duel, and not even noticed the coin leave his hand. He did not rage. Rage was for the early years. He stood very still, a master at the bottom of the deep water, and he understood the room completely for the first time, and the understanding was this: it would let him become a god, and it would charge him, for the privilege, exactly the things that had made him want to be anything at all. It did not take his power or his pride or his hate, those it left, those it sharpened, those it fed. It took the gentleness. It took, coin by coin, the small warm reasons a person bothers to protect anyone, and it would keep taking them for as long as he kept spending, until one gray morning he would reach for the thing that had started him counting and find a hole there too, and stop, and become the next set of faceless ranks the room sent out a fraction faster than the next poor clever child wanted them to be. That was when he found the watch with his eyes on the stone, ticking, and made himself read it, and the silver hand said it was 11 minutes to 9. He had 11 minutes of the world left before a boy was due in a chair. He had, if he wanted them, 1800 more years. The dead man's whole logic was in that gap, the entire gravity of the place, the exact slope a person slid down without ever feeling themselves move. There was always more time, and the next century always held the answer the last one hadn't, and the price was always so small, this once, just this once, and the only memory of refusing was the easiest of all to spend. Harry put his hand on the watch. He thought about the hole where the playground boy had been. He thought that he could not afford to be a person who would not notice, 1 century from now, when the room reached for the green that was kindness, or for Ron's grin, or for the reason any of it had ever mattered. He thought that the dead man had certainly also told himself he would stop in time. He stopped in time. He gathered the lifetimes, all of them, the whole impossible accumulation, and he carried them toward the gap, and he did not look back at the figure that wore his face, standing at the pillar in the gray light, watching him go with an attention that was his own attention, patient and not at all sure he would not be back. He crossed the threshold, and the room kept everything it had a right to keep, and let him carry out the one thing it had never been able to hold. He came out unbeatable. The world was very slow and very small and very dear, and he stood in the waking common room and made himself love it on purpose, because the alternative was the thing the figure's face had warned him of. It was full now. 8:30 had become 11 minutes to 9 while he lived 18 centuries, and the common room had filled with the ordinary roar of a school morning. First years lost in their own robes, a prefect shouting about a missing shoe, 2 girls arguing over a quill, the whole warm, slow human clatter of it. Harry stood in the middle of it, 11 years old, 1800 years deep, and every motion in the room reached his eye a quarter-second after it began, telegraphed, inevitable, already over before it happened. He could see the prefect's shoe under the sofa that the prefect could not see. He could see in the set of a 3rd year's shoulders the shove he was about to give a smaller boy, 3 full seconds before the boy himself would feel it. He moved through them toward the portrait hole at the world's pace, deliberately, a boy among boys, and it was the hardest magic he had ever worked, harder than fighting his own mirror, the magic of walking slowly when you have forgotten that anyone walks at all. It was on the stair down to the great hall that the room made him show his hand, and prove to him exactly what he had become, and exactly why he could never let it be seen. The moving staircases were swinging through their morning rearrangement. and a knot of students stood waiting on a landing for a stair to lock into place, and among them was a small Hufflepuff girl with her arms full of books and her attention full of nerves, and she stepped forward onto the stair half a second before it finished seating, into the hands-width gap between the stone lip of the landing and the stone edge of the stair, where the long drop of the central well went down and down through the turning castle into the dark. Harry was 4 steps above her and 20 feet away. A boy could not have reached her. A master could not have reached her either, not with his body. 20 feet is 20 feet, and a fall is faster than a boy. But Harry had not been a boy for 1800 years, and he did not reach her with his body. In the quarter-second the world gave him, which was, to him, a slow and ample and unhurried moment, time enough to consider and decide and act and reconsider, he asked the girl's weight very quietly, with no word and no wand he let anyone see, to be a suggestion rather than a law, just for an instant, just until her foot found stone, and the world, courteous, agreed, and the girl did not fall. Her foot came down on the gap as if the gap were floor and the stair seated under it a heartbeat later, and she walked on across it with her books and her nerves, never knowing she had stepped onto nothing and been held there by a thought, never knowing she had been, for a quarter of a second, the most carefully saved person in Scotland. No one saw. That had been part of the working, woven into it before he did it, because the saving and the hiding were the same act now, and he could no longer do one without the other. The students on the landing saw a nervous girl get safely onto a stair. The portrait saw nothing worth gossip. And Harry, 4 steps up, lowered the hand he had not raised, and felt the cold thing settle in him that he would carry for the rest of the year, which was not fear and was not pride, but was the simple, lethal, load-bearing fact of the gulf. He could have killed everyone on that staircase in the same quarter-second, with the same unraised hand, as easily as he had held one girl's weight. He noted that the way you note the temperature of a room you have to live in. It was not a wish. He had walled away long ago the part of himself that the room would have liked to feed. It was only a fact, the central fact of his new life, and the fact was this. There was no one in the castle, not the shouting prefect, not the tiny charms professor, not the long-bearded headmaster whose eyes Harry had felt on him at the feast like a weight. There was no one in this entire breathing school of 700 years and 1,000 souls who could stand against him for the length of a single thought. The slow world did not contain his equal. The only being that had ever fought him to a standstill was wearing his own face in the gray light below, and the only hand that had ever built that being was the hand he had come back to find. He went down the last of the stairs and into the great hall, into the noise and the light and the smell of 300 breakfasts, and he was the most dangerous thing in the room by a margin no one in the room could imagine, and exactly one person looked up. The headmaster looked up. He sat at the center of the high table behind a goblet and a half-moon pair of spectacles, an old man built like a folded heron, and he was talking to the tiny charms professor at his elbow, and he did not stop talking, and he did not change his face. And across the whole loud width of the great hall his eyes found Harry in the doorway and rested on him for exactly as long as the girl with the hunting eyes would later rest hers, a quarter-second too long, before they moved unhurried on. It was nothing. It was a headmaster glancing at a famous orphan on his first morning, the most natural thing in the world, and any other boy would have felt only the warm prickle of being seen by someone important. Harry felt the weight of an attention that had been waiting for him, and was patient, and was not at all surprised by whatever it had just measured, and he understood, before he had taken 3 steps into the hall, that there were 2 minds in this castle worth his caution, and that he had just been noticed by the second of them. The maker was below, in the gray light, in the worn stone and the rim script. And the keeper was here at the high table, drinking from a goblet, watching the door, and the keeper had known about that room for a very long time, and had let Harry walk down to it on his first night, and was now looking at what had walked back up. Harry let the boy come to the front of his eyes and looked away first, the way a child looks away from a teacher, and went to find his friend. He found Ron at the Gryffindor table, halfway down, with egg on his chin and a piece of toast suspended in front of his mouth, mid-sentence, telling a story to no one in particular about a ghost he'd seen in the night, and Harry sat down across from him and felt the 18 centuries recede, just slightly, just enough, in the warmth of a boy who liked him. This was the other half of the gulf, the half the staircase had not shown him, and it was the half that mattered more. He could hold a girl's weight with a thought. He could not, with all his lifetimes, make himself stop seeing how slow Ron was, how young, how open, every thought crossing the boy's freckled face a full beat before he spoke it, the whole transparent, unguarded human pace of him, laid out for Harry to read like a book in a language he had outgrown. Ron asked him if he was all right, mate. He looked a bit peaky, and the question reached Harry telegraphed and slow, and 3 seconds in the coming, and Harry, who had not had a friend in 1800 years, had to decide in the ample gray time the world gave him how a boy answers a boy. He took a piece of toast. He let his hand fumble it slightly, the way an 11-year-old's hand fumbles things, a small, deliberate clumsiness that cost him an act of will out of all proportion to its size. Didn't sleep, he said, new place. It was true, and it was a lie, and it was the first sentence of the rest of his life, the life in which everything true he said would also be a lie by omission, because the truth was 18 centuries wide and would not fit in any sentence a boy was allowed to speak. Ron nodded satisfied and went back to his ghost, and Harry ate the toast slowly at the world's pace, and watched the most ordinary thing he had ever seen, a boy eating eggs and talking with the helpless attention of a man who had spent everything he had to be able to come back and sit at this table, and had nearly in the deep water forgotten that this was the table he had paid to come back to. That was the discipline he chose, sitting there, not to hide the power, which was easy, but to keep the reason. The room had taken the playground boy because Harry had forgotten he was holding him. It would not take Ron. He carried the boy's freckled grin into the inner house before he had finished his toast, and he walled it where nothing patient could reach it. And he did the same with the smell of 300 breakfasts and the underwater sound of the bell and the particular way the morning light came down through the enchanted ceiling, because these were the things he had come back for, and a master who forgets what he came back for is just a weapon that has not yet been pointed. He looked down the long table while Ron talked. There was a girl with a great deal of brown hair reading a textbook propped against the jamb, mouthing the words 3 seats down, and her attention had a quality the others did not, a narrowness, a hunting focus, and as Harry watched, she came to the end of a paragraph and looked up, not at anything, just up, the way a person looks up when a thing they have read does not agree with a thing they know, and her eyes passed across the table and across Harry and stopped for the length of a held breath. A quarter second too long before they moved on, she had felt something. He saw it in the extra beat her gaze had spent on him. She did not know what she had felt, and she went back to her book and frowned at it, and Harry made a note of her the way you make a note of weather coming, because in a castle full of people who could not see him at all, the one who had looked twice was the one who would, eventually, see everything. 3 people had marked him this morning, a Hufflepuff girl who would never know it, a headmaster who knew far too much, and a first-year with hunting eyes who knew nothing yet and had the only kind of mind that could close the distance. He would have to be most careful of the one who knew nothing. The headmaster was patient and would wait and watch and play whatever long game an old keeper plays. The girl would simply relentlessly work it out. He did not know her name yet. He would learn it within the hour in a bright room with a tiny professor on a stack of books, when she put up her hand to answer a question no one else could, and got it perfectly right, the way he was about to make very certain he did not. The bell rang for the start of lessons, far off in the warm stone, slow and deep and underwater, and Harry Potter stood up from the breakfast table, 11 years old and unbeatable, and went to his first class to lose. There was a thing that happened to him on the way out of the Great Hall, and it was the first thread of the second half of the year, though he did not know it yet, and it taught him that the gulf was not the only strange thing he had carried up out of the deep water. He passed the gray lady on the marble stair. She drifted across a landing with her translucent face turned away, the Ravenclaw ghost, sad and proud in silver, a fixture of the castle that no living student gave a second thought, and Harry, who gave everything a second thought, who had spent 18 centuries learning to give the whole world a second and a third and a 400th thought, felt her pass him like a draft from a door left open onto winter, and stopped dead on the stair and could not have said why. It was not that she was a ghost. He had met the ghosts, the castle was full of them, nearly headless Nick and the fat friar and the rest, and they registered on his sharpened perception as exactly what they were, the cold pleasant residue of the dead, lingering harmless thin. The gray lady registered as something else. There was a wrongness in her that the others did not have, a tension, a thread. He reached for the word and found to his unease that the best word was the one he had been using all term for the room. She was venting. Something ran out of her and away, downward, into the deep stone, drawn taut, and the something was the same cold, patient flavor as the pipe that fed him in the gray light. And for one disorienting instant on the marble stair, Harry Potter could not tell whether he was feeling the ghost or feeling the room through the ghost, the way you cannot tell, touching 2 ends of one cold wire which end you have hold of. She felt him feel it. That was the part that stayed with him. Ghosts did not, as a rule, notice being noticed. They were too far gone into their own old grief. But the gray lady's silver head came round slowly, and her tired, beautiful face found the thin boy frozen on the stair, and her eyes, which had drifted incurious past 10,000 students across 1,000 years, fixed on him with a sudden, terrible attention, the attention of a creature that has felt, for the first time in centuries, a hand brush the cord it hangs from. For a held breath they looked at each other, the boy who had spent 1,800 years in a gray room and the woman who had spent 1,000 years paying for rooms like it, and something passed between them that was not words and was not quite recognition, but was, Harry thought afterward, closer to the way 2 people who have survived the same disaster know each other across a crowded room, a shared knowledge of a particular cold. Then she drew back fast, frightened, gathering herself up and away through the wall like a woman snatching her hand from a flame, and was gone, and Harry stood alone on the stair with the afterimage of her fear printed on the inside of his eyes. He did not understand it, but he set the moment down where he could keep looking at it, alongside the pipe and the dead man's name and the high cold thing he could feel behind a stammering professor's turban, and he understood that the castle was a great deal more crowded with secrets than a slow world suspected, and that at least one of them had just looked at him as though it knew him. He would come back to her. He did not know yet that she was the whole answer. He knew only that she was an anomaly, and Harry Potter walked toward anomalies the way other people walked away from them. He made himself move. He made himself walk down the rest of the stair at a boy's pace into the slow, warm river of students heading to their first lessons, and he let the puzzle of the Grey Lady sink for now beneath the more immediate puzzle, which was the next 80 minutes and the feather he had to fail to lift. And underneath the puzzle, all the way down the corridor, ran the thing he never spoke of and never would, the thing the gulf had left him that had nothing to do with power, the weight of remembering 1800 years inside the body of a boy who had lived 11. It was a strange freight to carry through a crowded corridor. He had memories older than the castle's furniture, older than the families of the children jostling past him, older than the languages some of them dreamed in. He had spent centuries alone in a gray room, and the centuries did not go away when the room did. They were in him, stacked, vast, a cathedral of accumulated time housed in a frame that came up to a tall man's elbow. He remembered things that had never happened in the world, duels against a self that wore his face, inventions he had made and unmade, the particular silver quality of a light that did not exist anywhere a slow person could go. He remembered being, for long gray stretches, something that was not entirely a person anymore, and he remembered the discipline it had taken to climb back down into personhood each time, to want toast and friendship and a warm bed badly enough to be a boy who could have them. The climbing back was the hardest magic he knew, harder than holding a girl's weight on a stair, and he did it every morning and no one would ever know, and that, not the loneliness of being unmatched, but the loneliness of being unwitnessed, was the true private weight of walking out unbeatable. He had become something enormous, and the price of hiding it was that the enormity had to live entirely inside one quiet boy, seen by no one, and a thing that is seen by no one begins, very slowly, to wonder whether it is there at all. That was the real reason he could not stop thinking about Hermione Granger, 3 seats away, who had looked at him twice, not because she was a threat to his cover, though she was, because she had looked. In a castle of 1,000 souls, she was the one whose gaze had snagged on the place where the enormity showed through, and a thing that has gone unwitnessed for 1800 years will follow a single witnessing gaze the way a plant follows light, helplessly, against every instinct of caution, toward the one person who might someday see the whole of it and not look away. He knew it was dangerous. He knew it was, in fact, the single most dangerous hunger he had carried up out of the deep water, more dangerous than the power, because the power he could hide and the hunger he could not, the hunger to be known, and it would, he understood even then, walking to his first class, be the thing that eventually cracked his whole careful term wide open. He was right, it would, but not yet and not today. He had thought about how to lose. He had thought about it for the better part of a century in the gray light, because it was the hardest engineering problem the room had left him, and he had wanted to get it exactly right. The trouble with sandbagging, he had worked out, was that a master fails differently from a beginner, and a watcher who knows the difference can read mastery in the shape of the mistakes. A beginner's wand wavers because the hand does not know the motion. A master who pretends to fumble makes a wand waver as a hand that does know the motion imagines a wavering, which is wrong, too clean, too symmetrical, a counterfeit of clumsiness that a sharp eye reads instantly as control. He had practiced in the deep water against the figure that wore his face, had set it to play the part of a watcher, of the long-bearded headmaster, of the girl with the hunting eyes, and he had learned to fail truly, to find again in himself the actual motion of a boy who actually cannot, and reproduce it not as parody but as memory, because somewhere walled in the inner house was a boy who genuinely could not levitate a feather. And the safest lie was to let that boy come to the front and do the failing while the master stood behind his eyes and watched. So he had a plan, and the plan was sound, and he carried it down the slow, bright corridor toward the charms classroom with the calm of a man who has rehearsed for 18 centuries. He would get the feather wrong on the first try and the second. He would get it almost right on the fourth, the way a lucky beginner does, and leave it there, unremarkable, one more first year who would clearly need work. The girl with the hunting eyes would get it on the third try and glow, and the tiny professor would beam, and no one in the slow, warm room would have the first idea that the quietest boy at the back could have lifted the entire castle off its foundations with a turn of attention, and set it down again without spilling a single one of 300 breakfasts. But the headmaster had looked up. That changed the arithmetic a little, and Harry adjusted as he walked, because a plan that does not adjust is a plan for a world that holds still, and the world had just shown him it was watching back. If the keeper had let him find the room, then the keeper wanted to see what he would do with it, and a perfect, seamless ordinariness was its own kind of signal. A boy with 18 centuries in him would of course produce a flawless imitation of having none, and a patient old mind that was looking for exactly that would find it in the very flawlessness. So Harry would not be flawless, he would let one thing show. Not power, never power, but the shape underneath it. A stillness, a steadiness, a way of watching a difficult thing without fear that no frightened first year has. He would let the headmaster see a calm boy, let the old man wonder about calm. Calm was a thing a hard childhood could explain. Calm was survivable. It was the 18 centuries that had to stay buried, and the way to bury them deepest was to give the watcher a smaller, truer mystery to hold so that he stopped digging for the larger one. He reached the classroom door. Through it came the scrape of chairs and the high, excited babble of children, and the squeak of a small professor climbing his stack of books, and the whole slow, ordinary music of a lesson about to begin. Harry stood in the doorway for one held breath, 11 years old, 1800 years deep, a master come to fail on purpose in a room full of children, with a price ticking under him and a name beginning with B cut into a stone 2 floors below, and a girl 3 seats down who had already looked twice, and an old man at a high table who had looked once and seen more. Then he let the boy who could not do it come to the front of his own eyes, and he walked in, and he took his seat, and he got ready very carefully to be ordinary. It was the most difficult thing he had ever attempted, and he had fought himself to a standstill for 100 years. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. Hiding the gift, the feather lay on the desk in front of him, white and ordinary, and Harry looked at it the way a swordsman looks at a butter knife he has been asked to lose a fight to. Professor Flitwick stood on his stack of books at the front of the room and squeaked them through the theory, and Harry let the boy at the front of his eyes listen, and behind the boy the master sat very still and ran the numbers one last time. The whole class would attempt the levitation charm today. Most would fail. That was the point of a first lesson, to fail in company so that the failing felt safe. He needed to fail among them without failing differently, and he had practiced the exact shape of an honest first year's failure against 100 years of his own watching face, and he was ready, and the only variable left in the room was the girl 3 seats to his left, who had her wand out already and her jaw set and the textbook's diagram burning behind her eyes. Now, don't forget that lovely wrist movement we've been practicing, squeaked Flitwick. Swish and flick. And saying the magic words properly is very important too, Wingardium Leviosa. The class swished, the class flicked. The class said the words badly, 3 dozen children mangling a Latin they had owned for a month, and a few feathers twitched and one caught fire, and Flitwick beamed and bounced on his books and called encouragement, and Harry raised his wand among the others and let his wrist do the thing he had taught it not to do, the overcorrection of a hand that does not yet trust the motion, and said the words a half beat off the rhythm that would have worked, and the feather did not move. Bad luck, he murmured to Ron, who had just made his own feather sit up and shudder and flop, and who looked delighted by the shuddering. He missed it again on the second try, and the third, and on the fourth he let it lift an inch, a wobbling, uncertain, lucky inch, the inch of a boy who has stumbled onto the edge of getting it right and does not know how he did it, and then let it drop, and he frowned at it the way you frown at a thing that worked once and won't again, and Flitwick passing patted his shoulder and said, "Close, Mr. Potter, very close, you'll have it by Friday," and moved on. And the master behind the boy's eyes noted with cold satisfaction that the lie had cost exactly what he had budgeted, and not a sickle more. Then the girl 3 seats over said the words. She said them properly. She did not mangle the Latin. She had clearly said it to herself 100 times in the privacy of wherever she said things, and she put the lift on the gar exactly where it belonged, and her wrist did the swish and flick cleanly because she had drilled it, and her feather rose off the desk and floated, serene and certain, 4 feet into the air, the only feather in the room that had truly obeyed. Flitwick cried out in delight and held her up as the example, and the girl went pink with the particular joy of a person who has been right out loud, and Ron muttered something sour beside him, and Harry watched her feather hang in the air and felt a thing he had not expected to feel, which was kinship. It was not that she was good. A first year levitating a feather on the first day was good for a first year, and nothing at all to a man who had asked the weight of the world to be a suggestion. It was the quality of the wanting. She had not lifted the feather because she had a gift. She had lifted it because she had decided to, and ground at it until the deciding became a skill, and that was the only road to anything Harry respected, the same road he had walked in the gray light for 18 centuries, the long road of a person who will not accept that a thing is beyond her merely because it is hard. He had walked it with infinite time, and she was walking it with a single human lifetime and a textbook propped against the jamb, and that, he thought, watching her glow, was the braver of the 2 journeys because she did not have a magic room. She just had the wanting. He would have to be very careful of her. He found that he did not want to be careful of her. He found that he wanted absurdly to talk to her about the structure of the charm for about 9 hours, and he walled that wanting too, gently, because a master who lets himself be lonely makes mistakes, and the loneliest he had been in 18 centuries was the moment he understood that the only person in the castle worth talking to was the one person he could never tell the truth. Her name was Hermione Granger. He learned it when Flitwick said it, holding up her feather, and he held it where he could find it because she was Weather, and Weather has a name. The first weeks of school went by at the world's slow pace, and Harry learned to live two lives in the gap between heartbeats. In the outer life, he was a quiet, unremarkable, slightly intense first-year named Harry Potter, who was bad at charms and improving, average at transfiguration, hopeless on a broom for exactly the first 10 minutes before becoming unremarkably competent, and who sat at the back of every class with the calm of a child who had been through worse than a quiz. He had decided to let the calm show. It was the smallest true thing he could give the watchers, a mystery that explained itself, and it worked, mostly. Teachers liked him without quite warming to him. Students found him steady and a little distant and pleasant enough to sit beside. Ron adopted him wholesale, the way Ron adopted everything that shared its food, and Harry let himself be adopted and guarded the friendship like a coal in cupped hands against the patient gray wind that he could feel, even up here, reaching for the gentle things. In the inner life, he ran an experiment that never ended, which was the experiment of how much to be. Every class was a calibration. In Transfiguration, Professor McGonagall set them to turning a match into a needle, and Harry knew the Transfiguration so completely that he could have turned the match into a living songbird and back without breaking the thread of her lecture. And instead he produced, on the appointed day, a match that had gone silver at one end and grown a suggestion of a point. Better than most, worse than Hermione, exactly average plus, the result of a boy who tried hard and had some knack. And McGonagall picked it up and looked at it and then looked at him over her square spectacles for a beat longer than the match deserved, because Minerva McGonagall had been teaching children to turn matches into needles for 40 years and knew the difference between a knack and a hand that was holding itself back, and could not have said which she was looking at and did not like not being able to say. He counted her among the watchers. There were more of them than he had hoped. The slow world could not see his power, but it could see the holes where his power was being hidden, the suspicious evenness of a boy who was never the worst and never the best, who failed in exactly the places a clever boy would choose to fail. He learned to roughen the pattern. He let himself be genuinely bad at herbology, which he found dull and therefore did not mind being bad at, and the badness was real and it bought him cover, because a boy with a true weakness reads as a true boy. He learned that the best place to hide a thing you cannot show is behind a thing you cannot do, and he cultivated his cannots like a garden. The broom nearly cost him the whole garden in an afternoon. It happened at the first flying lesson on the windy lawn with Madame Hooch barking and 20 school brooms lying in 2 crooked rows, and it happened because Neville Longbottom was frightened, and a broom is a stupid, eager, half-living thing that feels fear and bolts. Neville's broom bucked before the whistle and shot him into the sky sideways, 12 feet, 20, the boy clinging and screaming, and then it pitched and he came off it, falling, and Harry, flat on the grass with his hand on his own broom, had the quarter-second, and in it the whole catalogue of what he could do and could not be seen doing. He could have stopped Neville in the air. He could have asked the boy's weight to be a suggestion, the way he had on the staircase, and set him down on the grass like a feather, and it would have been invisible and perfect and witnessed by 20 children and a sharp-eyed instructor who would have spent the rest of the year asking why the Longbottom boy hadn't broken every bone he owned. So he did the harder thing, which was almost nothing. He let Neville fall, let the slow world's physics have him, because the fall was survivable. He had measured it in the first instant, grass and a boy's lightness and a height that meant a broken wrist and not a broken neck. And he spent his quarter-second on a single soft adjustment so quiet that even he almost couldn't feel it, a thumb's-width nudge to the angle of the boy's landing, so that he came down on the meat of his forearm instead of the point of his skull. Neville hit the grass and howled and clutched a wrist that was broken and not a spine that was not, and Madame Hooch came running, and no one, not one of 20 children, not the instructor, not the sharp gray wind, saw a thing but a clumsy boy's bad luck turning out a little less bad than it might have. And then Draco Malfoy, who missed nothing that could be turned to cruelty, snatched up the glass remembrall that had fallen from Neville's pocket and kicked off into the air to throw it onto the roof, and the whole lesson tilted toward the moment Harry had been dreading since September, the moment a slow world dares a fast thing to show itself, because Harry's broom was right there and his blood was up and there was a boy in the sky asking to be answered. He got on the broom. He told himself it was because not getting on it in front of Malfoy and a famous name was its own conspicuous tell, but the truth was simpler and he made himself look at it. He wanted to. After 18 centuries of throttling every motion down to a boy's clumsy pace, a part of him wanted just once in the honest wind to move, so he let himself a little, and it was the most dangerous indulgence of the term. He flew up to Malfoy and he was careful to fly like a natural and not like a master, a wild, unschooled, talented swoop and not the surgical thing he could have done. and when Malfoy threw the Remembrall in a high vicious arc toward the castle wall, Harry went after it in a dive that he kept deliberately ragged at the edges. A boy's reckless plummet, and caught the glass ball a foot from the stones, and pulled up, and it looked to the screaming, delighted lawn below. Like raw, untaught genius and not like control, it looked like a seeker, it did not look like a man. But Professor McGonagall had been watching from a window, and what she had seen was a first-year who had never been on a broom catch a falling object at a flat dive with the unhurried certainty of a professional, and she came out onto the lawn with her lips white, and Harry's heart went cold because he had miscalculated. He had let the wanting move his hand a half-inch past the boy and toward the master, and now a watcher had seen it. She took him away from the lesson. She did not punish him. She made him seeker, the youngest in a century, because the thing she had seen had only one shape that a slow world had a name for, and the name was talent, and a school feeds talent to a sport and asks no further questions. It was the best possible outcome, and it was a warning he did not waste. The wanting was a leak, and leaks sink ships, and he would not get on a broom and let himself enjoy it again, because next time the watcher at the window might be the one at the high table, and the headmaster had no Quidditch pitch to file his suspicions into. Hagrid was the one watcher in the castle Harry did not have to manage, because Hagrid watched nothing, and trusted everyone, and Harry found, to his own surprise, that an hour in the great warm cluttered hut by the edge of the forest was the closest thing he had to rest. He went on a wet afternoon with Ron for tea that came in buckets and rock cakes that lived up to their name, and he let himself be, for a single hour, an ordinary 11-year-old in front of a man too kind to read him, and the rest of it was so total that he understood why the room had never been able to give him anything like it. The room sharpened, Hagrid softened. The room made him more, Hagrid let him be less, and less was a thing Harry had not been allowed to be in 18 centuries, and he drank it like water. But Hagrid talked when he was happy, and Hagrid was happy, and a man who watches nothing also guards nothing, and somewhere between the second bucket of tea and the boarhound's head in Harry's lap, Hagrid said the thing that was not his to say. Ron had asked idly about the third-floor corridor, the forbidden one, and Hagrid had gone red and flustered and said it was nothing. Students weren't to know. It was between Dumbledore and Nicholas Flamel and no one else, and then clapped a hand the size of a dustbin lid over his own mouth and said he should not have said that. He definitely should not have said that. Forget he said it. Harry forgot nothing. He sat with a boarhound drooling on his knee and watched a kind man wish back a sentence, and behind the boy's polite face the master laid the new piece against the others. The thinning wards, the cold draining thing in Quirrell's classroom, the forbidden corridor, and now a name, Flamel, which Harry knew as everyone clever eventually knew it, the alchemist, the maker of the stone that bought long life. Somebody had hidden Nicholas Flamel's stone in the castle, behind the forbidden door, and somebody else was bleeding the school's wards to reach it, and Harry sat in the warm hut and felt the whole autumn click another notch toward whatever it was winding toward, and ate another rock cake so that Hagrid would not see him thinking. "You all right, Harry?" Hagrid said, because even a man who watched nothing could feel when a room went quiet. "Gone proper still, you do that. Granger does it too when she's working a thing out, pair of you always working things out." He shook his great head fondly. "Be children a bit longer, eh? Plenty o' time to be clever later." "Plenty of time," Harry agreed, and the irony of it sat in his chest like a stone, because he had more time than anyone who had ever lived, and it had cost him his mother's face, and a kind man was telling him to spend his childhood slowly, and Harry would have given a great deal, though not, he knew, the room. He was honest enough to know he would not yet give the room to be a boy for whom that advice still applied. He walked back up to the castle through the wet with Ron talking happily about dragons at his side, and he carried the name Flamel up the hill the way he carried everything now, turned over and over in a mind that never quite stopped, and he understood that the forbidden corridor and the breathing room beneath the castle were two different secrets with two different keepers, and that the thing in Quirrell's turban wanted the first and did not yet know about the second, and that this gap in the enemy's knowledge was, for the moment, the most valuable thing Harry owned that the room had not given him. The hardest watcher sat behind a cauldron in a dungeon and hated him on sight. Professor Snape did not like Harry, and Harry understood the not liking within the first minute of the first potions lesson, and understood that it had nothing to do with anything Harry had done, because it was older than Harry, aimed through him at someone Harry resembled, and that made it both easier and more dangerous. Easier because it was not about the room. More dangerous because a man who is already looking at you with that much attention will see a great deal he is not looking for. "Potter," said Snape, soft in the middle of the roll, the syllables of the name laid down like cards. "Our new celebrity." And then, without warning, the questions fired flat and fast across the cold dungeon. Powdered root of asphodel and an infusion of wormhood, a bezoar, monkshood, and wolfsbane. 3 questions a first year could not answer, designed to humiliate, designed to open a gap between the famous name and the ignorant boy behind it. Harry knew all 3 answers. He knew them completely from the self-writing book in 18 centuries of having nothing to do but learn, and the boy at the front of his eyes did not know any of them, and in the half-second the world gave him he made the most important calibration of the term. He could answer none, and be the disappointing celebrity Snape wanted, and vanish under the man's contempt which was the safe play, the small play, or he could answer one, just one. The Bezoar the simplest, the one a careful boy might have read ahead and remembered, a fact and not a mastery. He chose the Bezoar because Snape's contempt was a searchlight, and a boy who was merely, flatly stupid drew the searchlight closer, made it linger, made it probe, and a boy who showed one honest competence and then floundered on the rest gave the searchlight a place to rest and a verdict to reach. Clever enough, not special, a swot who'd read one page. The verdict would close the file. The contempt would do the rest. A Bezoar's a stone from a goat's stomach, sir, he said quietly to his cauldron. It'll save you from most poisons. And then to the asphodel in the monk's hood, he gave the floundering silence of a boy who has shot his one bolt, and let his ears go red and Snape's lip curled, and the searchlight found its verdict, a jumped-up swat, no better than the rest, fame and a memorized footnote and nothing underneath, and moved on to torment Neville Longbottom's cauldron, and the file, Harry judged, was as closed as it was going to get with a man whose hatred made him pay attention. He had miscalculated by exactly one thing, and he saw it only because he was watching for everything. Hermione Granger, 2 benches over, had her hand up for all 3 questions, straining, certain, and when Harry had answered the Bezoar she had turned her head and looked at him, and there had been a line between her brows. Not because he had answered. Because of how he had answered, to the cauldron quietly, without the hunger of a child who wants the credit, a fact set down and abandoned like a man putting exact change on a counter. She knew what wanting an answer looked like, she wore it on her own face every hour. And she had just watched a boy give a correct answer with no wanting in it at all, and it did not fit, and Hermione Granger did not let things that did not fit alone. He could see her deciding not to let it alone. He could see 3 benches away across a cold dungeon, the precise moment he became, to the one mind in the castle equipped to do it, a problem to be solved. She started watching him after that, and she was very bad at watching him, which was how he knew how good her mind was. A trained watcher hides the watching. Hermione had no training. She simply looked openly, frowning, the way she looked at a paragraph that contradicted a thing she knew, and Harry felt her gaze land on him a dozen times a day in the corridors, across the hall, in the library where she lived, and each time it was carrying a little more weight, a little more collected evidence. He could not have told her she was right, but he could see her becoming right brick by brick, and there was nothing he could do to stop it except be more ordinary, and being more ordinary in front of a mind like hers was its own tell, because a boy who got blander every time you looked at him was a boy who knew he was being looked at. There was a second thing eating the castle that autumn, and Harry hunted it the way she hunted him. He had felt the pipe all term, the thin cold thread of borrowed life that ran out of the room below and into the castle and away, the thread that fed him in the gray light and was anchored to something he could not see. And he had felt, layered over it, a second wrongness newer, hungrier, with none of the room's patience, a draining at the castle's wards, a thinning of the old protections, as if something were quietly bleeding the school's defenses to feed a purpose of its own. The two were not the same. Room's pipe was old and lawful and balanced, a debt kept on a ledger. The new draining was a theft, crude and accelerating, and it centered, when Harry traced it with the attention no one knew he had, on the back of the head of the stammering defense professor, Quirrell, who flinched from his own subject and smelled of garlic and fear, and underneath those, of something cold and patient and very nearly familiar. A high cold laugh Harry had carried since he was a year old and never once let the room touch. He went looking once on a night he had told himself he would not, up to the 3rd-floor corridor that the headmaster had forbidden at the start of term feast, because a forbidden door is an arrow pointing at a thing worth hiding, and Harry trusted arrows. He found the locked door and the great 3-headed dog behind it standing on a trapdoor like a sentence with a full stop under it, and he understood at a glance that the school was keeping something below the dog that the thing in Quirrell's turban wanted, and that the ward's Quirrell was bleeding were the wards around it. He did not open the trapdoor. He could have. He stood in the dark with a beast that any other first year would have died of, and a door any other wizard would have needed an hour to open, and he chose to learn rather than to act, because a master who tips his hand on a Tuesday in October to satisfy his curiosity is a master who has forgotten that the whole of his advantage is that no one knows he has any. He had decided coldly in the inner house, weighing it for 100 greylit hours, that the thing in Quirrell was not yet strong enough to be worth the cost of revealing himself, that it was reaching for whatever lay beneath the dog and had not got it, and that he, Harry, would watch it reach and learn what it reached for and choose his moment. It was the correct decision. He hated it because the cold, familiar thing in the turban had murdered his parents, and a master who could unmake an army was choosing to sit in the back of its classroom and take notes. He kept the decision anyway, because the alternative was to throw away 18 centuries of advantage to satisfy a year-old boy's grief, and a master does not let the boy hold the wand. Then Quirrell led a troll into the castle as a distraction on Halloween, while the feast roared above and the careful term ended in a girl's bathroom. Harry was moving before Professor Quirrell finished his staged feint at the head of the hall, and he made himself move slow. He had felt it the instant it began, the cold draining spike, and slide away toward the third floor, which told him where the man was really going and that the troll was a curtain drawn across a theft. And closer, a quieter misery he had half-tracked all day, that Hermione Granger was not at the feast. She was not at the feast because Ron had made her cry. Harry had heard it after Charms, Ron's careless voice carrying down the corridor. She's a nightmare, honestly, no wonder she hasn't got any friends, and had seen her go past with her face held very still and her eyes very bright, and had said nothing, because saying something was a kindness and kindnesses were expensive, and he was so very tired of being careful. He had let her go. And now there was a troll loose in the castle, herded in by a man with murder in his turban, and the one girl clever enough to see Harry coming was crying alone in a bathroom because of a boy Harry had chosen not to correct. This was the hardest engineering problem of the term, and he solved it at a dead run that he had to throttle down to a boy's clumsy sprint, because the truth was he could have been at the bathroom before the troll, could have unmade it between one of its steps and the next, so fast and so cleanly that no one would ever have known there had been an incident, and he could not do any of it where it could be seen. He pulled Ron with him. Hermione, she doesn't know about the troll, partly because it was true and partly because a witness who believed in a clumsy version of events was the best cover there was, and the two of them pelted through the cold stone while the teachers ran the other way toward the dungeons where Quirrell had told them the troll was, and Harry let Ron lead, let Ron's panic set the pace, and behind his own eyes the master watched the troll's progress through the castle like a man watching a clock. They reached the bathroom a half-step behind the troll, which had smelled the crying girl and gone in after her, 12 feet of gray muscle and a club the size of Ron, and Hermione was backed against the broken sinks with her wand forgotten in her hand, and her clever mind locked white with the oldest fear there is, the fear of a body much larger than yours that means you harm. The club came up. Harry had a quarter second, ample and slow, and he spent it on disguise. He could not let the troll die untouched. He could not let it fall without a visible cause. So he gave the moment a story a slow world could believe, and he built the story out of Ron, because Ron was there and willing and would remember it as his own. Ron the club Wingardium Leviosa now, and Ron, terrified, brave, useless, swished and flicked and shouted the words he'd finally mastered that very week, and his wand pointed more or less at the troll, and the club more or less above it, and in the half-beat between Ron's word and the world's response, Harry reached out with the attention no one could see and made the spell true. He took Ron's wavering, half-aimed, first-year levitation charm and he finished it, lifted the great club clean out of the troll's grip, held it at the top of its arc, and brought it down on the troll's own skull with exactly the force required and not 1 ounce more. A single clean lethal blow that looked, to every eye in the room and to Ron's own astonished memory, like a lucky boy's lucky spell going miraculously, impossibly right. The troll dropped. The bathroom rang with silence. Ron stood with his wand out and his mouth open, staring at what he was certain he had done, already half believing the version of himself that had done it, and Hermione slid down the wall with her hands over her mouth, and Harry stood in the doorway breathing hard on purpose, performing the exhaustion of a boy who had run a long way and been very frightened, and he had done it. He had saved her and hidden the saving in the same motion, the way he saved everyone now, invisibly, at no apparent cost. Except that Hermione Granger was looking at him, not at Ron who had cast the spell, at Harry who had not. She had been against the wall, facing the door, and she had seen not the magic had been invisible, but the choreography of it, the wrongness of the timing, the way the famous Lucky Club had come down a half-beat after Ron's spell should have either worked or failed, the way Harry's eyes had been on the troll and not on Ron's wand, the way Harry was performing breathlessness with his chest while his eyes were as calm as a pond. She had spent 2 months collecting bricks and the troll had just handed her the last one, and Harry watched the wall finish building itself behind her eyes, watched the line appear between her brows and stay this time, and knew that the careful term was over. The teachers arrived then, McGonagall white and furious, Snape limping and watchful, Quirrell stammering at the rear with something cold and satisfied moving behind his fear, because the distraction had worked, the third-floor corridor had been visited, whatever he had gone to do he had done, or nearly. Hermione, to Harry's surprise, lied for them. She told McGonagall she had gone looking for the troll herself, stupidly, and that the boys had saved her, and she took the disapproval onto her own shoulders to keep the 3 of them out of worse trouble. And it was the first brave thing he had seen her do that was not about being right, and he understood that she had not lied to protect Ron, who had nearly got her killed, but to buy herself time alone with the real question, which was Harry. And at the high table that night, when the three of them filed back into a feast gone quiet, the headmaster's eyes found Harry over the rim of a goblet and rested on him a quarter second too long. And Harry understood that the keeper had read the bathroom the same way Hermione had, not the magic, but the shape of the luck, the suspicious tidiness of a famous boy at the center of a survivable miracle, and had added it, without expression, to a ledger Harry could not see and was beginning to fear. She found him 2 days later. She found him in the one place he had thought safe, which was the disused corridor near the library where he went to be unwatched, and the fact that she had found it meant she had been following the pattern of his absences, and the fact that she led with that told him exactly how far she had got. "You disappear," Hermione said, no greeting. She had a roll of parchment in her hand, covered in her fierce small handwriting and a great many numbers. "Every morning before breakfast, sometimes at night. I've been keeping track. I know that's mad, I know how it sounds, but you go somewhere in the tower and you come back wrong. You come back tired in a way that doesn't match how long you were gone, and I started writing down the times, and then I started writing down other things, and Harry," she unrolled the parchment, and her hand was not quite steady, and Harry saw that she was frightened, and that she had come anyway, which was the bravest thing about her. "The castle is losing time. There's an hour that doesn't add up. I checked it against the astronomy clock and the kitchen clocks and the charms on the corridors. And there's an hour every day that the wards record and the clocks don't, an hour that gets spent somewhere, drawn off, and I couldn't find where for weeks. And then I stopped looking at the castle and started looking at you. And the hour you vanish is the hour that goes missing. It's the same hour, it's you, you're the—" She ran out of words, which he suspected did not happen to her often, and stood in the cold corridor holding a roll of arithmetic that was, every figure of it, correct, having reconstructed from clocks and ward readings, and the stubborn refusal of a brilliant mind to accept a thing that did not add up, the existence of a room she had never seen and could not imagine. The room below, the pipe, the missing hour, all of it, derived from the outside by sheer wanting, the way she had lifted a feather on the first day. Harry looked at her for a long moment, at the parchment and the steady frightened eyes and the line between her brows that was never going to go away now, and he made the decision he had been not making since the first morning, the decision he had walled away rather than face, and he found making it that it had already been made, somewhere in the gray light, by the part of him that had wanted for 2 months to talk to her for 9 hours about the structure of a charm. "Not here," he said quietly. "Not where the portraits can hear." He glanced up the empty corridor at the patient painted eyes that reported everything to a headmaster who already knew too much. "Tonight, the library, the back, after everyone's gone, bring the parchment." Hermione Granger stared at him, and the fear in her face was joined by something else, something he recognized because he had worn it on the first night at the foot of a breathing pillar, the terrible bright hunger of a mind that has found a real question at last. "It's real," she breathed. "Whatever it is, it's real." "It's real," Harry said, "and it's older than the school, and it's killing me very slowly, and it's already killed at least one person, and I think the thing in Professor Quirrell's head is trying to find something like it, and I have not had anyone to tell for 1800 years. He heard the number leave his mouth and watched it land, watched her flinch from it and then helplessly lean toward it, because it was the most impossible thing anyone had ever said to her, and she could no more walk away from it than he could. 1800, she repeated, faint. "Tonight," said Harry. "I'll start at the beginning. It's a long story, and I've had a very long time to get it right." He left her standing in the corridor with her correct arithmetic and her impossible new question, and he walked back toward the warm noise of the school. And for the first time since he had come out of the gap unbeatable, the loneliness in him had a door in it, and the door was open, and he was too tired and too glad to be afraid of what he had just let in. Below them both, through the floor and the deep stone, the room breathed in and out with the hitch, and spent its patient hour and waited. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Who built it? He told her everything in the back of the library in the dead hours by the light of a single shielded flame, and it took less time than he had feared, because Hermione Granger did not need a story told slowly. She needed it told correctly, and a thing told correctly is told fast. He told her about the breathing and the gap behind the tapestry and the disc that kept honest time. He told her the ratio, 1 hour, 10 years, and watched her do the arithmetic he had done on the first night, watched her arrive at the same cliff edge and stand at it white-faced. He told her about the figures in the self-writing book in the 18 centuries, and she did not say it was impossible because she had a roll of parchment in her bag that already proved it was not, and a mind that would rather rebuild the world than deny a number. He told her about the cost, the mother's face going soft. The playground boy turned to a clean-edged hole, the patient gray wind that reached always for the gentlest thing. That was the part that undid her, and it undid her not with fear but with fury, and the fury told him more about her than 2 months of watching had. "It takes the kindness," she said, very low when he had finished. Her hands were flat on the table and her eyes were bright and hard. "Of all that it could take anything, it could take your times tables or your Latin or your, and it takes the one afternoon someone was nice to you. That's not a price, Harry, that's designed. Somebody designed it to do that. You don't build a thing that reaches past a person's whole memory for the single warmest thing in it unless you meant it to. unless taking that specifically was the point. Yes, said Harry, and felt something in his chest he had not felt in 1800 years, which was the relief of being understood by someone who was not himself. That's exactly what I think. The room isn't a wild thing. It's not a tide, however much it acts like one. It's a machine, and machines have makers, and the maker chose tenderness as the fuel on purpose, and I have spent a very long time wanting to know why, and I could not find out from inside because the answer isn't in the room. It's in whoever built it. Hermione was already pulling parchment toward her, already uncapping ink, the fury folding itself into the cleaner shape of work. Then we find the maker, she said. It's 1,000 years of castle. Somebody wrote something down. Somebody always writes something down. She looked up at him, and for a moment the fear came back into her face, but it was a different fear now, a shared one. And we find out what it's costing. Not you, you said it's killing you slowly, but slow isn't the word that worries me. You said there's a pipe. You said something keeps your body alive in there and you don't know where it draws from. Harry, the memory it takes from you is the fee. You said that yourself, but a fee isn't the whole price of a thing. Where's the rest of the bill going? He looked at her across the single flame, and he understood with the cold clarity that had served him for 18 centuries that he had been right to be careful of her, because she had walked into the most important question in under an hour, the question he had carried out of the deep water and not answered. The memory was the fee. The life was the principal, and somebody somewhere was paying the principal, and it was not him. That, he said, is the thing we have to find out before anything else. Because whoever's paying it has been paying it for 1,000 years, and I've spent more in one morning than the room has taken from anyone in a century, and if there's a balance somewhere, I think I've just come very close to the bottom of it. He showed her the room the next night because she asked, and because a mind like hers would not be governed by a description when a door existed, and it was a mistake, and he knew it was a mistake even as he led her down through the sleeping common room to the faded tapestry, and he made it anyway because he had been alone with this for 1,800 years, and the wanting to show someone was the one hunger the room had never managed to take. He did not let her go in. He was clear about that before they left the dormitory stair, and she agreed, and they both meant it, and it did not matter in the end, but it mattered to him that he had tried. He lifted the tapestry, and she got down beside him in the dark, and the gray light touched her face, and he watched the most rational person he had ever met look through a gap in a wall at a thing that should not exist and go entirely still. Oh, Hermione said, just that. The light lay on her like snowlight, even and sourceless, and through the gap the great round chamber breathed in and out with the hitch, and at its center the pillar stood with its dark disk catching and turning, a degree at a time, patient as a thing that has all the time there is. She did not reach for it. She knelt in the crawlspace mouth with her hands pressed flat to her own knees, holding them there on purpose, and Harry saw her do it and loved her a little for it, because she had understood without being told that this was a place where you kept your hands to yourself. That's the disk you measured by, she breathed. That's the honest clock. And the slope's real. Look, the light bends toward the center. You can see the time pooling. It's like looking down into a well that the water's been pulled out of. She stopped, and her scientist's rapture cracked, and underneath it was the fury again, and underneath the fury was grief. You lived your whole second life in there. 1,800 years on that floor alone, and you came out and sat next to me at breakfast and let your hand fumble a piece of toast so I wouldn't notice. Her voice was not steady. I noticed. That's the thing, Harry. I noticed the fumble was too good. I've been angry at you for 2 months for being a mystery, and the mystery is that you've been doing the loneliest thing a person could possibly do every morning before class and pretending you hadn't. Don't, Harry said, because the patient gray wind had come up out of the gap to touch his face, cool and sweet, and he had felt it lean, very slightly, toward the warm thing she had just said, and he understood with a cold lurch that the room could reach a little way out of its own door, that a gentle thing spoken in the gap was a coin laid down on the threshold, and he was not going to let her tenderness be the next thing it took. He drew her back from the gap firmly into the honest dark of the common room and let the tapestry fall, and the gray light was a line under it and then nothing. Don't say the kind things here, he said. Not near the door, it hears them. It leans toward them. I have spent 18 centuries learning that the only safe place to be gentle is somewhere the room can't reach, and I'm not going to watch it take the fact that you noticed. She looked at him in the dark, and the fear came back into her face, and this time it was the right fear, the useful one. It can reach out of the door, she said slowly, even a little. Then it isn't only a room, is it? It has a reach, it has a want. She wrapped her arms around herself. Harry, what touches a thing like that and doesn't get taken? 1,000 years. There has to be something it can't have, or there'd be nothing left of anyone. That, said Harry, is the right question, and I don't know the answer, and I think the only person who does has been dead for 1,000 years, and I think her daughter is still here. He had felt the shape of it forming since the register. Now, in the dark with the door breathing behind the tapestry, it set hard. We've been reading the holes in books. There's a hole in this castle that's older than the books, and it drifts through the towers at night, and everyone thinks it's only sad. Ron knew he was being left out and bore it badly, and that was its own small problem in a season of large ones. He cornered Harry at breakfast 3 days into the research, while Hermione was already in the library and the bench beside Harry was conspicuously empty of her, and he had egg on his chin and hurt in his face, and he said, "You two are off doing something, all the time now, you and Granger, with the looking things up and the going quiet when I sit down." He stabbed a sausage. "I helped with the troll, I was there, I'm just saying, whatever it is, I was there for the troll." And Harry, who could have deflected him in half a sentence, who had deflected far cleverer people that very week, looked at the freckled, hurt face he had carried into the inner house and walled against a patient gray wind, and found that he did not want to deflect it, and that the not wanting was the most human thing left in him. "You were there for the troll," he agreed. "You were brave for the troll, which is rarer than clever, and I'd rather have you at my back than almost anyone in this castle, and I can't tell you what we're doing yet, because it's dangerous in a way that being brave doesn't help, and the first thing I'd be doing if I told you is putting you in front of it." He held Ron's eyes. "When it's something brave is the answer to, you'll be the first I come for. That's not me managing you, that's true. Some of what's coming is going to need exactly what you've got and neither of us has, and when it does, I'll come find you, and you'll wish I hadn't." It should not have worked. It was, after all, a way of asking a boy to wait outside a locked door. But it was true, every word, and Ron heard the truth in it the way he heard everything plainly, and he went a bit red and said, "Well, all right then, and as long as I'm not being managed," and gave Harry his second sausage, and Harry ate it, and thought that of all the things 18 centuries had taught him, the most useful in this slow, warm world was the one the room had tried hardest to take. That you keep the people who are brave for you by being honest with them, and you spend honesty the way the dead seer had spent her 40 years, deliberately, on the few things worth not having forever. The restricted section gave up its secrets the way a clever enemy does, which is to say partially, and in a pattern that told you as much by what was missing as by what remained. There was no book about the room. They had not expected one. A thing built to be forgotten is not indexed. But Hermione, who treated a library as a country with laws, found the room anyway, in the holes. She found a Founder-era treatise on the magic of borrowed duration, with 3 pages cut out at the binding, the cut old and clean and deliberate. She found a list of the castle's chambers, drawn up in the 14th century, that numbered the rooms of the 7th floor and skipped one, counted to a chamber, then to the chamber 2 doors on, as if the room between had been not hidden but unwritten, removed from the count by a hand that did not want it found. They worked by a flame Hermione had charmed to die the instant a footstep crossed the section's threshold, and twice it died, and twice they sat in the black between the shelves with their hearts going while Madame Pince drifted past on her rounds like a vulture inspecting a field, and twice she moved on, and they breathed again and lit the flame and went back to reading the shapes of the things that had been removed. And in a crumbling register of the school's dead, Hermione found a single line that stopped them both. Berenger of the Long Hour, who came to teach the year the founders parted, and was not seen to leave, and is counted neither living nor dead but only owing. Berenger, Harry said, and the cold went down his spine, because the name on the stone 2 floors below began with a B, and the man who had cut 400 years of tally into the floor and signed himself on his first sure day had had a name, and here it was, written by a hand that had known him, Berenger of the Long Hour, not the maker, the first to pay, counted neither living nor dead but only owing. The year the founders parted, Hermione read, and her voice had gone careful. "That's Harry, that's a real date, that's when the 4 of them fell out and Slytherin left. Everyone learns that, but nobody says why Ravenclaw." She stopped. She turned back 2 pages, forward 3, hunting, and Harry watched her find it the way he had watched her lift the feather, by refusing to accept the gap. "Rowena Ravenclaw's daughter died that year. Helena, it's in every history, she ran away, she was killed, her mother died of grief soon after, that's the story. That's the whole story, 4 lines, every textbook, the sad Ravenclaw daughter. But look," she held the register up to the shielded flame, and the light came through the old paper and showed, behind the line about Helena's death, the ghost of an erased line, scraped and written over, the way the troll-year clocks had hidden a missing hour. Somebody changed it, somebody took out what really happened and wrote in grief and ran away, the same way they cut the pages, the same way they skipped the room in the count. Harry, the entire history of how this castle was founded has a hole cut in it exactly the shape of that room, and the hole is named Helena. Harry looked at the erased line he could not read, and he thought about the pipe, the thin cold thread of borrowed life running out of the room and into the castle and away, anchored to something he could not see, something old enough to have been paying for 1,000 years and alive enough to pay. "There's someone in this castle who was here when the founders parted," he said slowly. "Who's been here ever since, who would know what really happened to Helena Ravenclaw because, and the certainty arrived all at once, cold and total, the way his certainties did, because she is Helena Ravenclaw, the Grey Lady, the Ravenclaw ghost. She's been here 1,000 years, Hermione, drifting through the towers, and everyone thinks she's just sad, and I have walked past her a dozen times this term and felt something wrong about her and never stopped to ask what, and I think she's the other end of the pipe. I think she's what's been paying." Before they went to the books, they tried to measure the thing directly, because Hermione did not trust a fact she had only read and Harry did not trust a fact he had only felt, and between them they had a rule that a thing known 2 ways was worth 10 things known 1 way. The trouble was that only one of them could feel the pipe, and feelings are poor evidence, so Harry made himself into an instrument, and Hermione made herself into the one who read the instrument, and they spent a careful hour in the disused corridor, turning his perception into numbers she could write down. He told her where the cold thread ran and how thick it felt and which way it pulled, and she made him say it the same way twice, an hour apart, to see whether the feeling held still, and it did, which meant it was probably real and not the kind of thing a tired mind invents. The pipe ran out of the room below, through the deep stone, and away, not down into the earth, where a person might expect a buried thing to anchor, but sideways and a little up, into the body of the castle itself, toward the high towers, and it did not weaken with distance the way a natural drain would. It held its strength all the way to wherever it ended, which meant the far end was not a reservoir slowly emptying but a thing actively paying, a source with a will in it, choosing every hour to keep the account open. A reservoir runs out, Hermione said, chewing the end of her quill, the numbers spread between them on the cold floor. A spring keeps giving until the spring itself fails. You're describing a spring, Harry. The room isn't draining a pool somebody filled 1,000 years ago. It's drawing on something that's still alive, or near enough to alive to keep giving. Whatever's at the far end of your pipe hasn't been dead this whole time. It's been paying this whole time, every hour, for 1,000 years. She looked up, and the horror was arriving in her by the clean cold road of arithmetic, which was the only road her mind ever fully believed. That's so much worse than a buried battery. That's a someone. That's a someone, Harry agreed, and felt the word settle into the place where the dead man's tally and the high cold thing already sat, and understood that the night was going to end with a name and a face, because a pipe that ran toward the high towers and never weakened ran toward a person, and the persons who had lived in this castle for 1,000 years and never left were a very short list, and most of them were transparent and drifted through walls. They tried once to follow the pipe with more than feeling. Hermione had a theory, a clever, dangerous theory, that if the cord carried life it might carry a signal, that a thing pushed gently up the pipe from this end might be felt at the other, the way you can find the far end of a rope in the dark by shaking it. Harry refused. He refused flatly, and he did not soften the refusal, because he had felt her lean toward the pipe with the bright, reckless hunger of a mind that wants to test its own idea, and he had a sudden cold certainty, unprovable, the kind he had learned not to ignore, that to push anything up that cord was to introduce yourself to the thing at the other end, and that the thing at the other end was not the only thing listening on the line. "Don't touch it," he said. "Not with your hand, not with a spell, not with a clever signal. You've already touched it more than anyone alive. You rebuilt the whole room from the outside. You knelt in the gap and read the slope of the time. You've done arithmetic on a thing that eats people. That's enough. That's already, I think, more than enough. Whatever this turns out to be, I do not want it knowing your name before we know it." He did not understand, that afternoon, exactly how right he was or how late the warning came. The warden did not need a hand on a cord. It needed only a mind that had touched the working with intent, and Hermione Granger had touched it more truly than anyone since the cleverest woman who ever lived. But that was a horror for a colder night, and for now they rolled up the numbers and put away the quill, and Harry kept the certainty where he kept all his certainties, in front of him, where he could go on looking at it, because the thing he had just told Hermione not to do was a thing he could feel the room would have very much liked her to try. The Grey Lady did not want to be found, which in a ghost is a particular kind of haunting. She moved through the high cold corridors of Ravenclaw's tower like a woman avoiding a room in her own house, and it took Harry 3 nights to corner her, and he did it in the end not by chasing but by waiting, in the dark at the top of a stair she could not avoid forever, with the patience the room had taught him. She came at last out of the stone, tall and proud and translucent, with a face that had been beautiful and was now only tired, and she saw him sitting in the dark and went still, and Harry felt it again, stronger now that he was looking for it, the wrongness in her, the thin cold thread that ran out of her and down through the castle toward the grey light below, drawn taut, drawn thin, drawn almost to nothing after 1,000 years of drawing. "You feel it," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was the sound of wind in an empty hall. "No one has felt it in a very long time. The boy who teaches himself in my mother's room. You feel the cord." "I feel the cord," said Harry. "It runs from you into the room. It's been feeding the room for 1,000 years. He kept his voice even, the way you keep your voice even with a frightened animal or a person at the edge of a long fall. It's you. You're the principal. The room takes memory from whoever uses it. That's the fee. That's the small change. But the life it spends to keep them alive in there, the years it burns, it's been drawing all of it out of you, hasn't it, for 1,000 years. The Grey Lady looked at him with her tired, beautiful, ruined face, and then she did a thing ghosts are not supposed to do, which was to sit, lowering herself onto the cold stone step beside him as if her legs were tired, as if 1,000 years were a weight a body could feel even when the body was gone. My mother, she said, was the cleverest woman who ever lived, and she could not bear to lose anything, and that is the whole of the story, and everything else is detail. She looked down the dark stair at nothing. She saw her own death. She was a seer among everything else she was, and she saw the year and the manner of it close, too close, and she could not bear it, not the dying. My mother feared no honest thing but the unfinished. She had 100 years of work left in her and 40 to live, and she could not bear to leave the work undone. So she built a room where 40 years could become 4,000, where she could finish everything. Where she could outrun the death she had seen by simply having more time than death had patience for. And it worked, Harry said. It worked perfectly, said the Grey Lady, which is the cruelest thing that can happen to a clever person. It worked, and it needed a price because everything does, and my mother had read the deep grammar of the world more truly than anyone before or since, and she knew you cannot make time, you can only move it. To give herself 4,000 years, she had to take them from somewhere, from some life bound close enough and willing enough to anchor the cord. The ghost turned her ruined face to him, and the grief in it was 1,000 years deep and still fresh, the way the room kept all the sharp things fresh. She did not mean to use me. You must believe that because I did not for a very long time, and the not believing is most of what is wrong with me now. She meant to anchor the cord to herself, to spend her own future, to buy her own present, which is a clean enough bargain, a person spending only what is theirs. But she made one mistake, the only mistake she ever made, which is that she told her daughter what she had built. And her daughter was proud, and her daughter was clever in the smaller way that thinks it is the larger way, and her daughter believed her mother was about to do something monstrous and selfish, and her daughter went into the room one night to destroy it, and put her hands on the pillar to break it, and bound the cord to herself instead. Harry finished very quietly, and the cold in his spine had become a kind of horror, because he had heard the shape of this already 2 days ago in Hermione's voice. Where's the rest of the bill going? You touched the mechanism. You touched it meaning to break it, and the room doesn't care what you mean, it cares what you touch. You touched the anchor stone and it anchored to you, and then your mother, my mother, came in and found her daughter bound to the thing she had built, paying for it, already beginning to pay, and she could not unmake it because she had built it too well, because she had built it specifically so that nothing learned inside it could turn against it. The Grey Lady's voice did not break because it had broken 1,000 years ago and there was nothing left in it to break. She had made a perfect machine and made it perfectly, and the perfection was the trap, and her daughter was caught in it and she could not get her out. So she did the only thing left. She stopped using the room. She left her work unfinished, all 4,000 years of it, the whole reason she had built the thing. She left it undone, and she walled the room out of the count and cut the pages and changed the register, and she let the world believe her daughter had run away and died because the truth was worse. Her daughter had not died. Her daughter could not die. Her daughter was bound to a cord that would keep her here, neither living nor dead, paying down a debt for anyone who ever found the room for as long as the room existed. And then my mother died of the death she had seen on the year she had seen it, because she stopped running from it the day she understood what the running had cost. The ghost looked at her own translucent hands. She could have had 4,000 years. She chose 40 in grief and an early grave rather than spend one more hour of me. It is the only thing she ever did that I have forgiven her for. It took me 800 years to forgive it. I am a slow learner for a clever woman's daughter. Harry sat in the dark beside 1,000-year grief and made himself think, because thinking was the only gift he had to give her and the only tool that had ever saved him, and the thinking led somewhere cold. Berengar, he said, the man whose name is on the floor, he found the room after your mother sealed it. Long after, said the Grey Lady, centuries, the Count forgot it the way my mother meant it to, and then one day a clever, hungry, lonely man found a tapestry in a gap in a breathing wall the way you did, and he went in, and the room woke because the room does not sleep, it only waits, and he used it. He used it the way you have used it, more carefully than most, for he was no fool. He kept his count. He built his defenses, but he used it for 400 years, and every hour of it, every memory the room took from him, and every year it spent to keep him alive was paid by me. I felt him. The wind in the empty hall, very low. 1,000 years I have hung on this cord and felt the room spend me, and most of them are quiet, because most centuries no one finds the door. But when someone is inside, I feel it. I feel myself drawn thin to pay for them, and Berengar drew me thin for 400 years, and at the end of it there was not enough of him left to climb out, because the room had taken every gentle thing that might have made him want to, and not enough of me left to keep paying, and so the room did the last thing it is built to do when the principal runs low and the debtor cannot leave. It collected, said Harry. It woke the warden. The Grey Lady's ruined face turned to him, and for the first time there was something in it that was not grief but warning. When a debtor cannot pay and cannot leave, the room takes the debtor, all of him, all 400 years of what he became, the whole terrible mastery a man builds in the deep water, and it makes of him a keeper for itself, a collector. The warden is Berengar, boy. It is what is left of the cleverest man to find this room before you, wound into a thing that exists to do one task, to find the next debtor when the balance runs low and bring the account to settlement. It has slept since it took him because the balance has been quiet because no one has spent enough to wake it. She looked at him and the warning in her was complete. No one had spent enough. In 1,000 years, no one had come close to the bottom of me. And then this autumn a boy went into my mother's room and lived 1,800 years in a single morning. The cold in Harry was total now, and it had a shape, and the shape was the arithmetic Hermione had handed him days ago and he had been carrying since. I've spent more in one morning than the room has taken from anyone in a century, and if there's a balance somewhere, I think I've come very close to the bottom of it. How close, he said. How close did I come? You did not come close, said the Grey Lady. You crossed it. 1,800 years is more than Berengar spent in 4 centuries of careful hours because you spent it all at once in the deep water at the center where the cord runs thinnest. You drew down in one morning what 1,000 years of accident had left of me. The balance is gone, boy. I have nothing left to pay with. And a room that cannot pay its principal, with a debtor who has just demonstrated he can spend faster than anything in its history. She rose, the tired weight of her gathering up off the step, drawing back into the proud cold drift of a ghost who had said the thing she had been avoiding for 3 nights. It is already waking. I have felt it stir since the morning you came out unbeatable. You did not just learn magic in my mother's room. You rang a bell that has been silent for 500 years, and the thing that answers bells is climbing up out of the deep water to find out who is going to settle the account, and it will want a new anchor because I am spent, and it will take the nearest life that has touched the mechanism with intent, the way the room took me. Harry was already on his feet, already running the names, already knowing the answer before he finished, because there was only one other person who had touched this, not the stone, but the mechanism, the system, the whole working of it with intent, with the fierce reconstructing intent of a mind that would rather rebuild the world than deny a number. Hermione, he said, she's been doing the arithmetic. She reconstructed the whole room from the outside. She knelt in the gap last night and read the slope of the time with her own eyes. She touched it with her mind, with intent, as completely as your daughter touched the pillar with her hands. Then I am sorry, said the Grey Lady, and she meant it, with 1,000 years of knowing exactly how sorry a person could be, because the warden does not distinguish between hands and minds. It distinguishes only between those who have touched the working and those who have not, and your clever friend has touched it more truly than anyone since my mother. And when the warden comes up out of the deep water to choose the next thread to hang the debt on, it will weigh you, who can spend faster than it can collect, against her, who cannot fight it at all, and it will choose the one it can hold. They were waiting for him at the foot of the tower stair, and it was not Hermione, and it was not the warden, and for one cold instant Harry could not decide which would have been worse. Albus Dumbledore stood in the dark of the corridor with his hands folded into his sleeves and the moonlight catching the half-moons of his spectacles, and he did not look surprised to see a first-year coming down from the Ravenclaw Tower at 2 in the morning, because he had plainly come there to meet one, and Harry stopped on the 3rd step and looked down at the second mind in the castle worth his caution, and understood that the careful term had not one ending but 2, and here was the other. She told you then, said Dumbledore. It was not a question either. His voice was gentle and very old and entirely unfooled. Helena, she has not spoken of it to anyone in 300 years. You must have asked her the right way. You have a gift for the right way, Mr. Potter. I have been watching it develop with great interest since the first morning of term, when a boy came down to breakfast moving like a man who had decided not to. So he knew. Harry had supposed it since the first weight of the old man's eyes across the great hall, but supposing and hearing were different things, and hearing it cost him a breath he did not let show. How long, he said, how long have you known about the room? I have known about the room, said Dumbledore, for considerably longer than you have been alive, and I have known what it does, and I have known that it would one day be found by a child clever enough and hungry enough and lonely enough to use it the way you have used it, because that particular combination is rarer than you would think and more common than I would like, and the castle produces one every century or so, and I have made it my business across a long career to be standing at the bottom of the stair when they come down. He inclined his head, and there was no malice in him at all, which was somehow worse than malice. I did not stop you, Harry. You will have noticed that. I could have sealed the gap in September. I have known where it is for 50 years. I did not. I want you to understand that I chose not to, and to ask yourself why, because the answer is the most important thing I have to teach you, and I would rather you arrived at it than swallowed it. Harry looked at him, and the cold clarity turned over and found the shape of it, because the shape had been there since the Grey Lady said the word keeper. You're not protecting the school from the room, he said slowly. You could have sealed it in a morning. You're using it. You're testing. You let the clever, lonely ones find it every century, and you watch what they do, and you're waiting to see. The understanding completed itself, and it was very cold. You're waiting to see whether one of them will be the one who breaks it. Whether one of them goes in and comes out and instead of spending themselves down to warden the way Berenger did, the way they all do, finds a way to settle the account and free what's bound to it. You've been auditioning successors, not to the school, to the debt. Something moved in the old man's face that might, in a younger man, have been grief. Every child who has found that room in 1,000 years, said Dumbledore, has been destroyed by it because the room is built to destroy, and the destroying is so slow and so sweet that they thank it on the way down. I have watched 3 of them in my time. I have stood at the bottom of this stair 3 times and watched a brilliant child come down changed, and I have not been able to save a single one, because the room cannot be fought from outside and cannot be survived from in, and the only person who ever found a 4th way is a woman who has been dead 1,000 years and bought the 4th way with her own life and her daughter's endless one. The blue eyes found Harry's, and they were not testing now. They were simply old and tired and asking. You are the first one I have ever met who came out still able to lie about it, still able to plan, still, however thinly, still able to love something. I have watched you guard that Weasley boy's friendship like a man banking a fire. The others came out and could only burn. You came out and are still somehow deciding. And so I have not sealed the gap, and I have let you run, and I have watched, and I have hoped, because I am an old man who has buried 3 children he could not save, and you, Harry, are the first one in 1,000 years who looks as though he might save himself and perhaps her with him. She's already chosen who pays next, Harry said. The room, the warden, it's waking up. I spent too much all at once, and the principal's gone, and it's coming up to anchor the debt to a new life, and it's going to take Hermione, because she touched the working and she can't fight it, and I can. His voice did not shake because he had not let it, but the thing underneath it was the closest he had come to fear in 1,800 years. It's coming for my friend because of arithmetic I made her do. So I don't have a century, Professor, and I'm not your next audition with all the time in the world to grow into wisdom. The bell's already rung, the warden's already climbing, and the only question I have time to answer is the one your dead seer couldn't. How do you settle a debt with a machine your own dead mistress built so that nothing learned inside it can ever break it? Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment in the moonlit dark, an old man at the bottom of a stair he had stood at 3 times before, looking up at a child he did not know how to save. I do not know, he said at last, and the honesty of it was the most frightening thing he had said. I have never known, that is why I have only ever been able to watch. But you, Harry, you have 1,800 years in you, and a mind that the room sharpened instead of breaking, and you have just learned the one thing none of my other 3 ever learned, which is the true shape of the price and the name of the woman who said it. The room was built so that nothing learned inside it can turn against it. The old man stepped back into the shadow, and his last words came quiet out of the dark. But you did not learn everything inside it. You have just learned the rest of it out here from a ghost in the cold with a friend's life on the table and a clock running. Perhaps that is the way through. Perhaps the room can only be broken by a thing it never got to teach you. I would think quickly if I were you. The warden has not woken in 500 years, and I felt it stir an hour ago, and it is not climbing toward me. He was gone, the way the very old and the very powerful go, between one breath and the next, and Harry stood alone on the cold stair with 1,000-year grief drifting in the tower above him and a friend asleep in a warm bed 2 floors below, and somewhere under the deep stone, in the gray light where he had lived 18 centuries. A thing that had once been the cleverest man to find the room uncoiling itself out of 400 years of debt and beginning, patiently, lethally, to climb. Harry went down the stairs 3 at a time, and he did not bother now to move like a boy. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, the cost comes due. He went to Hermione first, because the warden wanted her, and the first rule of defending a thing is to stand between it and the threat, and he found her already awake, already dressed, sitting bolt upright on a common room sofa at 2:30 in the morning with her wand in her hand, and her face the color of the dead fire's ash. Something's in the castle, she said before he reached her. Her voice was very steady, which was how he knew how frightened she was. I woke up and there was Harry. There's a cold going through the walls, not a draft, it moves. It's been moving toward the tower for an hour, and it stops outside doors, and then it moves on like it's reading the rooms, like it's looking for. She stopped. She had worked it out, of course she had worked it out. It's looking for me, isn't it? The thing you went to find out about. It's the cost, and the cost is me. It's the warden, Harry said, and it is not going to have you. And he was glad, distantly, that 18 centuries had taught him to make a sentence sound like a fact, because saying it was the only weapon he had against the part of himself that had already done the arithmetic and knew how thin the odds were. He told her the shape of it in the time it took to cross the room. Berenger, the 400 years, the keeper made from the last man who could not pay, the room spent down to nothing and coming to collect on a new thread. He did not soften it. She had earned the truth and would have caught him out in anything less. And Hermione Granger listened to a description of a thing built out of 4 centuries of a dead master's mind, a thing coming up through the castle to bind her to a debt and hang her on a cord beside a 1,000-year ghost, and when he finished she was quiet for one breath, and then she said the thing that told him why he had broken 18 centuries of discipline to let her in. Then we don't let it get a clean choice, she said. You said it weighs the targets. You said it takes the one it can hold. So we make me hard to hold and you easy to find, and we don't fight it where it wants to fight. We fight it where the walls help us. And Harry, her clever, frightened eyes came up to his. You've spent this whole term making sure no one ever saw what you can do. The one thing that thing won't have planned for, the one thing nobody in this castle has planned for, is you not hiding anymore. It was exactly right, and it was the permission he had not known he was waiting for, and something in his chest that had been clenched since the first morning of term came loose. No, he agreed. It won't have planned for that. Nothing in 500 years has. And then the cold came through the wall. It did not break the stone. It walked through it the way the Grey Lady walked through it, because it was made of the same impossible material as everything the room touched, and it came out of the solid wall by the dead fire as a deeper gray in the gray dark, a shape that resolved as it stepped into the room. And the resolving was the worst part, because for 1,000 years the figures had had no faces, and Harry had grown used to fighting faces that were not there, and the warden had a face. It was a man. It had been a man. It was tall and worn and translucent like the Grey Lady, but where she was tired the warden was finished, scoured smooth, a human shape that had been sanded down to its single function, the way the stone of the floor had been sanded down by 400 years of sitting. Its face was the face of someone who had once been clever and hungry and lonely, and Harry knew it, because he had knelt over the name it had signed on its first sure day, and because it had very faintly worn into the smoothness of its ruined features the structure of his own, not his face, but the kind of face his might become if he sat in the deep water 400 years and let the room take every gentle thing until there was nothing left but the mastery and the debt. You are the one who rang the bell, said the warden. Its voice was the room's voice, the cool, sweet, patient breath given words, and under it, faint, a man's voice, Berenger's, a Welsh lilt worn nearly to nothing, a clever man's cadence with the cleverness gone and only the cadence left. It did not look at Harry when it spoke. It looked at Hermione past him, weighing, and Harry felt the weighing land on her like the weight of the headmaster's eyes multiplied 1,000-fold, an attention that was doing arithmetic on her life. The account is overdrawn, the warden said to her, not to him. The principle is spent. A debt requires an anchor. You have touched the working. You will serve. It raised a hand, not a wand. It was past wands, as Harry was past wands, and the cold in the room sharpened toward a point, toward Hermione, the first reaching of a cord that would bind her for 1,000 years. Harry stepped into the line of it and stopped being a boy. He did it the way he had practiced for 1,800 years against the thing that wore his own face, without a word, without a visible motion, a turn of attention that asked the reaching cold to be a suggestion rather than a law, and for the first time since the 3rd year of his first decade, the world did not entirely agree. The cold bent, it did not break. It curved away from Hermione and around Harry, and he held it there, a thing no living wizard could have touched at all, and he felt, holding it, exactly what the Grey Lady had warned him of, and what Dumbledore had been auditioning for across a century of dead children. The warden was not a figure. The figures had been a fraction better than him on purpose to teach. The warden was 400 years of a master who had not been teaching anyone anything, 4 centuries of the deep water poured into a single lethal function, and it was not a fraction better than Harry, and it was not worse. It was the only thing he had met in 2 lifetimes that was, very nearly, his equal. You can hold the cord, the warden observed in Berenger's worn lilt, and turned its ruined face to him at last, and there was something in it that might have been the ghost of interest, the last ember of a clever man noticing a worthy problem. No debtor has held the cord in 1,000 years. You spent 1,800 years. Of course you can hold it. It tilted its head. It will not matter. I am the collection. I do not need to win. I only need to outlast, and outlasting is the one thing I have left, the one thing the room did not sand away, because outlasting is all a collector is for. And it came for him. The fight took the common room apart, and it took it apart silently, because both of them were past the noise of magic and into the cold place underneath it, where a duel is 2 minds spending the future faster than each other, and a sleeping tower full of children never woke. Harry had not fought at full power in the slow world even once. He had held a girl's weight on a staircase, finished a boy's spell on a troll, nudged a falling child a thumb's width, careful, hidden, invisible surgeries, all of them. Now he stopped hiding, and the thing that came off him filled the room, and the dead fire relit and flattened and went out, and the chessboard's pieces fled screaming under the sofas, and the windows did not break only because Harry would not spend the attention to let them. He opened with the unmaking because it was the deepest thing he had, and the night did not have time for courtesy. He reached past the warden's reach into the structure of the thing, and he asked it, with the dangerous knowledge he kept walled in a roomless room, to come apart, the way he had unmade armies of figures, the way a thing comes apart when a master tells it the secret of its own seams. And the unmaking slid off the warden like water off the disc, because there were no seams to find. You cannot tell a thing to come apart when it has already come apart 400 years ago and been wound back together as a function with no life in it to unwind. The warden took the deepest blow Harry owned without so much as slowing and answered it, and the answer drove Harry back across the room and cracked the paneling and would have folded a lesser thing in half. And Harry held it barely and learned in the cost of the learning the first true rule of the night. He could not unmake what was already unmade. So he stopped reaching for the seams and started reaching for the function. If the warden could not be killed, perhaps it could be confused, given 2 debtors to weigh and made to stall on the weighing, the way a clever question stalls a clever mind. He split himself in the deep, cold place. He threw out a working that wore the shape of a second Harry, a decoy thread for the collector to weigh, and for half a beat it worked, the warden's ruined attention forking, the cold dividing, and then it laughed, Berenger's worn Welsh laugh, almost kind, the laugh of a master watching a student try a trick the master invented 400 years ago, and it collapsed the decoy with a contempt that cost Harry another year of strength to survive, and said, "I made better ghosts than that in my 2nd century. Debtor, you forget I am you 400 years on. There is no faint in you I did not wear out before you were born." And it pressed, and Harry gave ground, and the giving of ground was a thing he had not done since the 7th year of his 1st decade, and it frightened him more than the cold did. He could not win, and he understood fully now why, and the understanding was the coldest thing the night had given him. He was the better duelist. He had crossed 18 centuries and the warden only 4, and where they met in the deep place his mind moved faster and reached further and saw more of the next half-second. But the warden did not need to win. It was not alive, it could not be killed, because killing is the unmaking of a living thing, and the warden had been unmade already, and what was left was a function with no life in it to take. He could hold it. He could hurt the shape of it, scatter it, drive it back into the wall by a second, by a minute. He could not end it. And every exchange spent him not memory, the room could not reach him out here, but the simple animal fuel of a body that had not, after all, slept, that was 11 years old and running on 18 centuries of discipline and nothing else. And the warden spent nothing because it had nothing left to spend, and a war between a thing that tires and a thing that cannot is a war the tiring thing loses, given time, and time was the warden's whole inheritance. So Harry stopped trying to win because winning was not on the table and started trying to understand, because understanding was the only table he had ever won at. "You don't want her," he said, in the cold between exchanges, holding the warden's reach a hand's breadth from his own chest. "The room wants an anchor, you're the room's collector. But you, Berenger, you signed your name on your first sure day, and you kept your count for 400 years, and a thing with nothing left in it doesn't keep count. You kept count because some part of you was still keeping faith with the man who walked in. He's still in there, you're still in there, and he doesn't want to hang a clever, frightened girl on a cord for 1,000 years any more than I do." The warden did not answer with words. It answered with a redoubling, a fourfold pressure that drove Harry to one knee and cracked the stone of the hearth and would have ended a lesser thing. And Harry held it barely, the holding costing him a year of strength in a second. And he understood that he had been right, and that being right had not helped, because the part of Berenger that was still in there was precisely the part the room kept chained, the part that suffered, the part that was made to watch its own hands do the collecting. The warden was not heartless. The warden was a heart wound into a function it could not refuse, and that was worse, and the worse of it was the lever if Harry could find it, and he had a quarter-second, ample and slow, to find it in. He tried, then, the thing he had been saving, because a master saves his best work for the moment the ordinary work fails, and the ordinary work had failed. He stopped meeting the warden blow for blow, and instead did the thing he had spent 100 years of the deep water learning against the only opponent worthy of it. He stopped fighting where the warden was, and started fighting where the warden would have to be. He read the collector's function the way he had learned to read the first figure's faceless line, not the wand but the weight, not the spell but the certainty underneath it, and he found in the smooth, scoured shape of the thing the one constant he could exploit. The warden was a collection, and a collection cannot help reaching for the debtor. It was built to close on him, could not choose not to, and a thing that must reach is a thing whose next move you already own, so Harry baited it. He opened a line down his own guard, a real one, a deadly one, the kind of gap that on any ordinary night against any ordinary master would have been suicide, and the warden, being a collector, being unable to refuse a debtor's exposed throat, committed to it with the whole cold weight of 400 years. And Harry was not there. He had moved on the lie the instant the warden bought it, the way he had first beaten the first figure in the 3rd year of his 1st decade, walking his reel, working through the opening the enemy had committed to. And for one bright cold instant it worked, the unmaking went home. The deepest blow he owned struck the warden square where a living thing keeps the thread of its life, and the gray shape staggered, came apart at the edges, scattered into the gray light like smoke struck by a fist. For half a heartbeat Harry thought he had won, and the thought was the most dangerous thing in the room because it was wrong. The warden reassembled. It did not heal. Healing is what living things do, and the warden was not living. It simply was scattered and then was not scattered, the gray light that composed it flowing back into the man's shape with the patient indifference of water finding its level. Because you cannot kill what is already dead, and you cannot scatter what has nothing to hold together but a function, and the function did not care that its body had been smoke a moment before. It came back exactly as it had been, the same worn face, the same cold reach, and it had cost Harry a decade of his strength to scatter it, and it had cost the warden nothing at all to return, and Harry understood, watching his best work undone by a thing that simply declined to stay broken, the true and final arithmetic of the night. He was spending his life by the year to inconvenience a thing that could not be inconvenienced, and the bank he was drawing on had a bottom, and the warden's did not. "You fight beautifully," the warden said in Berenger's worn lilt, and there was no mockery in it, which was worse than mockery. It was the flat assessment of a master who had once fought this well himself and remembered, dimly, what it had felt like to believe the fighting could matter. "Better than I did. I never thought of the open guard feint until my second century, and you had it in your third decade. If this were a duel, debtor, you would already have won it a dozen times over." The cold reach pressed in, patient, inexorable, a hand's breadth from Harry's heart and gaining. "But it is not a duel. A duel ends when one fighter cannot continue. A collection ends when the account is closed, and the account is not closed, and so I do not end, and so I win, not because I am better, but because I am after, and there is always an after, and you cannot be in all of them, and I can." It tilted its ruined head, and the last clever ember in it considered him almost gently. "You are trying to defeat the ocean by being a stronger swimmer. You will swim magnificently, and then you will tire because you are alive and the ocean is not, and the ocean will have you, the way it had me, and you will stand here in 500 years telling some other clever drowning child that they swim beautifully. Stop swimming, Harry Potter. It is the only advice I have left to give, and I give it because you tasted like kindness, and I had forgotten the taste. Stop swimming and find the shore." And Harry, holding the cold reach off his heart with a strength that was draining out of him by the year, heard the advice underneath the advice, the thing the drowned man could not quite say because 500 years had sanded away the part of him that knew how, that the way out was not to be a stronger swimmer, not to win, not to fight the ocean at all, but to do the one thing the ocean had no answer for, the thing no drowning person ever thinks to try because every instinct screams against it. Stop swimming, stop fighting the thing that cannot be fought. Give it instead the one offering it has never in 1,000 years received, freely, with open eyes, and let it choke on a gift in a throat built only for theft. He did not have the whole of it yet. But he had the shape, and the shape had come from the enemy's own mouth. From the last warm ember of a man the room had spent 500 years trying to put out and never quite had, and Harry understood, holding the warden off his heart, that this was exactly what Dumbledore had meant on the cold stair. The room can only be broken by a thing it never taught you, because the room had never taught him to stop swimming. The room had taught him only to be the strongest swimmer who ever lived, and the strongest swimmer still drowns. The not swimming he had learned somewhere else, from a ghost, from a dead man's mercy, in the cold with the clock running. The reach touched his chest, cold as the bottom of the deep water, and Harry knew he had seconds and not minutes, and that the seconds down here were the last currency he had not yet spent. He found, instead, the other threat, because the night had been holding it in reserve. The cold draining at the castle's wards, the second wrongness, Quirrell's wrongness, the thing he had been tracking all term, spiked, suddenly, hugely, far below, and Harry felt the school's old protections gutter like candles in a wind, and he understood in a flat, cold instant exactly what had happened and exactly how the two threats were won. The room, waking the warden, had drawn down everything it could reach to do it, the principal gone, the Grey Lady spent, the room reaching wider and wider for the life to fuel its collector, and the nearest reservoir of bound and ancient power in the castle was the wards themselves, the 1,000-year protections woven into the stone, and the room had been bleeding them all night to fund the thing now trying to kill Harry in the common room. And the man with the cold thing in his turban had been bleeding those same wards all term for his own purpose, patiently, slowly, and tonight the room had finished the job for him. The wards were down. The path to the third-floor trapdoor, to the great dog, to the thing the school had been hiding beneath it, it was open tonight because the room had spent the school's defenses to wake its warden, and the thing in Quirrell's head had felt the wards fall and was moving now, fast, toward the prize. And the prize was not, Harry realized, only the stone. He felt it the way he felt everything in the deep cold place, a vast patient attention turning in the dungeons far below, the high cold laugh, the murder of his parents, the thing that had worn a teacher like a coat all term, and he felt it pause on its way to the trapdoor and lift its head and notice. Notice the war in the tower. Notice the impossible power coming off the common room, power that had no business in a castle of children. Notice underneath that the thing it had been too small and too cautious to notice before tonight, the breathing room beneath the castle, the bell Harry had rung, the source of endless time. A stone that made you immortal was a fine thing. A room where an hour was 10 years, where a careful immortal could become a god at his leisure, where time itself could be spent and never run out. That was a finer thing, and the cold attention in the dungeons turned away from the trapdoor in the stone, and turned with a terrible new interest toward the deep gray light under the school, and began unhurried, certain to climb toward it. Two threats, one coming up out of the room to bind Hermione to a debt. One coming down into the room to seize it for a horror that would never, ever stop spending it. And Harry between them, 11 years old, on one knee in the wreck of a common room, holding the first off his friend with a strength that was running out, while the second made for the one place in the world where Harry's power was greatest and his hiding was over. "Harry," Hermione said from the angle of the wall, and her voice cut through the cold because it was the only warm thing in the room. "You can't hold it. I can see you can't hold it. It doesn't get tired and you do." She was crying, and she was not letting it stop her thinking, which was the bravest and most Hermione thing he had ever seen. "So stop holding it, stop defending. You said the room can only be broken by a thing it never taught you. It taught you to fight, it taught you to win. It never taught you to lose on purpose, because nobody who's winning ever does. What if the way out isn't beating it? What if it's giving it what it actually wants, but giving it wrong?" And there, on one knee in the slow, ample quarter-second the world gave him, with a dead master's reach a hand's breadth from his heart and a cold horror climbing toward the room and his friend weeping, the one true thing in the building, Harry Potter saw the shape of the fifth way. It was not a way to win. Hermione was right, there was no winning here, against a thing that could not tire and a thing that could not die. It was a way to lose so precisely, so deliberately, so much on his own terms, that the losing settled the account and broke the machine in the same motion. The way Rowena Ravenclaw had broken her own running by stopping it, the way a debt is sometimes only cleared by the debtor agreeing at last to pay the one price the collector never expected, which is the whole of it willingly, with eyes open, in a place and a manner of his own choosing. But he could not do it here in the common room, with the wards down and the horror climbing and Hermione in the line of fire. He could only do it in the room in the deep water at the center, where the cord ran thinnest and the disc kept honest time and a debt could be settled at the one ledger that mattered. And to get there he had to do the thing that cost him the most that whole terrible night, the thing that was the true price of it, the one he had been refusing since the first morning of term. He had to let the warden take something, to buy the time to choose where to pay. He stopped holding the cord, and he let the warden reach past him toward Hermione, and in the instant it committed to her, in the instant its whole 400-year function locked onto the easy thread, the holdable one, the girl who could not fight, Harry did the cruelest tender thing he had ever done. He put himself in the cord's path, not as a wall this time, but as a better offer, and he opened, deliberately, the one door in the inner house he had sworn never to open, and he let the room see what was behind it. He let it see the gentle things. He had spent 18 centuries walling them, his mother's kindness, Ron's grin, the first warm wand, the smell of 300 breakfasts, the entire reason any of it had ever mattered, and he tore the walls down all at once and offered the whole warm, bleeding hoard of himself to the reaching cold, because the room ran on tenderness and he was, suddenly, the richest source of it in the castle, richer than a frightened girl, an irresistible account. And the warden's function could not refuse the better thread any more than water can refuse the lower ground. The cord turned from Hermione, it turned to Harry. It sank into the opened house and began, ravenously, to feed, and it cost him. It cost him exactly what he had spent 1800 years refusing to spend. He felt his mother's kindness go, not the fact of her, the room could not take the fact, but the warmth of the green, the thing he had carried since he was a year old, lifting out of him like breath off cold glass, and he let it go on purpose with his eyes open, and the letting go was the most expensive thing he had ever done, and he had infinite practice at doing expensive things. He kept one. He had time in the slow quarter-second to save one thing from the wreck, to snatch it back behind a final wall as the rest poured out, and he did not save his mother, and he did not save the first wand, and he did not save the smell of breakfasts. He saved Ron's grin. Because Ron was alive and could make more, and a thing that can be remade is a thing worth keeping a wall for, and his mother's warmth could not be remade, and so it was, in the terrible arithmetic of the night, the one he could afford to spend. The warden fed and Harry emptied, and in the feeding the thing made of 400 years of debt got, for one instant, exactly what its dead heart had been starved of for 5 centuries. Warmth, gentleness, the human reasons a man bothers, and the ruined face above the cord changed. And the change was the lever Harry had been hunting, because Berenger, somewhere in there, tasted kindness for the first time in 500 years and remembered, for one instant, that he had once been a man who walked in on a sure day believing it would be all right. "There," Harry said, emptied, swaying, 11 years old and robbed of his mother by his own hand, holding the warden's whole attention on himself and off his friend. "That's what it took from you, that's what it took from me. That's what it's going to take from her and the next one forever, and you're the one it makes do the taking. I'm going down to the room, Berenger, to the center, to the disc." I'm going to settle the account at the only ledger that counts, and I'm going to do it tonight, because there's a worse thing than you climbing toward that door right now, and I will not let it have a machine that turns kindness into time. You can come and collect me there the proper way at the proper place. Or you can remember for one more minute what you tasted just now, and you can decide whose side a man is on. The warden hung over him, full of stolen warmth, its ruined face working, and it did not answer, because the answer was not a thing 500 years had left it able to say. But it drew back. It drew back from Hermione entirely, and it drew back from Harry, and it gave him in Berengar's worn Welsh lilt, the only gift a collector has, which is the rule spoken plain, the rule it had been built to enforce and had perhaps, for one warm instant, begun to wish it could break. 3 ways the account clears, the warden said. The debtor pays the principal, all of it, his whole future, every year he will not now live, poured into the disc until the balance is whole. He breaks the room, though none has done it in 1,000 years, and the woman who built it so that none could, and you are clever, debtor, but you are not cleverer than the cleverest woman who ever lived. Or he becomes the next collection, as I did, and the account waits quiet for the next clever lonely child, and the cord finds a new thread and it goes on. It receded into the cracked wall, the stolen warmth going with it into the deep gray light below, and its last words came up out of the stone like cold water. Pay, break, or become. The disc keeps honest time, debtor. You have until it finishes the turn it began the morning you rang the bell. Come down. I will be waiting at the center where I have waited 500 years, and where the other thing that climbs toward us will find us both. It was gone. The common room was a wreck of cold ash and fled chess pieces and one weeping girl, and Harry Potter stood in the middle of it, hollowed of his mother, holding a single grin behind a single wall, with a horror climbing toward the room from below and a deadline turning on a disc and 3 doors in front of him, every one of which cost everything. Hermione came off the wall and caught his arm as he swayed, and her face was wet and furious and afraid, and she said, "What did it take, Harry? What did you give it?" Because she had seen the door open and the warmth pour out, and she would not be lied to. "My mother," Harry said. The word came out steady, because he had 18 centuries of practice and 1 wall left, and he was spending the steadiness on her, the way you spend the last of anything on the thing that matters. The warm part. I kept Ron's grin because Ron can make another one. I couldn't keep her too. I had room for 1 wall, and I chose the one that could be rebuilt. He looked down at the girl holding his arm, and he found that he had after all one true thing left to say, and that the room could not take it because it was not gentle. It was hard and clean and cold as the deep water. I'd have given it you if it had taken you, all of it, every wall, so don't you dare tell me it was too high a price. I know exactly what things cost. I've had 1,800 years to learn, and it took me that long to find one single thing I'd empty the whole house to keep, and there are 2 of them asleep in this tower, and I am going down to that room to make sure the machine that eats people like us never gets to eat anyone again. They had a little time before the descent because the disc had not quite finished its turn, and Harry spent it the way he had learned to spend everything, deliberately, on the thing most likely to matter, which was getting the 2 minds he trusted pointed at the right question. 3 ways it clears, he said low and fast, while Hermione bound a torn strip of her own sleeve around a cut on his hand that he had not felt take. Pay, break, become. Pay means I pour my own future into the disc until the balance is whole. Every year I would have lived, gone, and a debtor who pays with his future just becomes the next thing on the cord, so paying is a slower way of losing. Become means I let it make a warden of me like Berengar, and the account goes quiet and waits a few centuries for the next clever child, which is not a solution, it's a postponement with my name on it. That leaves break. Break, which the cleverest woman who ever lived built it to be unbreakable against, Hermione said, tying off the strip with a fierceness that was half terror and half refusal. From the inside, she built it so nothing learned inside it can turn against it. That's what you keep saying, that's what the ghost said, that's what Dumbledore said, nothing learned inside. She went still, her hands stopping on his. Harry listened to the sentence. Nothing learned inside, she armored it against the inside. She spent 1,000 years of genius making sure no power earned in the deep water could ever be turned on the machine. But she never said a word about the outside. Why would she? Nobody breaks a thing they've never seen. The only people who ever even found the room were people who went in and got eaten before they could tell anybody anything. There's never in 1,000 years been a person who understood the room completely and was standing outside it, free, uneaten, with a clock and a friend and a reason. Until tonight, Harry said very quietly, and felt the first cold edge of the 5th way slide into place, not the whole of it, not yet, but the shape of the gap it would fit through. Until a debtor walked out still able to lie about it. The one thing she couldn't armor against is a thing the room never gets to teach you, because by the time it's taught you anything you already belong to it, and I've been taught the rest of it out here, by a ghost, in the cold, with your life on the table. He looked at her, and the cathedral of 18 centuries turned over in him, vast and fast, hunting through everything it knew for the precise shape of a lever that lived in the one blind spot of the cleverest woman who ever lived. It's there. I can feel that it's there. I just can't see it yet, and I have until the disc finishes its turn to find it, and the disc is most of the way through, and the thing that killed my parents is climbing toward the door. Then we think on the way down, Hermione said, and we think fast and we think together. And she said together like a person planting a flag, like the bravest and most stubborn fact in the building. And Harry, hollowed of his mother and holding one grin behind one wall, took the word and kept it where he kept the things worth keeping, because it was hard and clean and the room could not have it. He felt the cold thing in the dungeons turn far below and begin to climb faster, drawn by the same bell that had drawn the warden, greedy for the same endless time, and he understood that the descent could not wait for the descent to be safe, because nothing about tonight was going to be safe, and the only safety left in the world was on the far side of a problem he had not yet solved. He did one more thing before he woke Ron, and it was the coldest and most careful thing he did that whole terrible night, and it was a measurement. He sat down for 10 seconds of the world in the wreck of the common room, and he closed his eyes, and he went down into the deep place where he did his truest thinking, and he weighed himself, honestly, the way he had weighed himself against 3 figures in the 5th year, the way he weighed everything, without flattery and without flinching. He had 1800 years of mastery, minus the strength the warden had spent out of his body, minus his mother's warmth, minus whatever the descent would cost. He had one friend who could think as fast as a problem moved, and one who would walk into fire on a promise. He had a disc finishing a turn and a deadline he could not extend. And he had climbing toward him 2 of the 3 most dangerous things in the castle, the warden, which could not be beaten, and the shade, which could not be killed, converging on the one room in the world where his own power was greatest. It was, he judged, almost exactly an even fight if he found the lever. It was an unwinnable one if he did not. And the margin between those 2 outcomes was a thing he could not buy with power, because he had more power than anyone who had ever lived, and it was not enough. The margin lived entirely in a single insight he did not yet have, a thing that was true and small and waiting in the blind spot of a dead genius, and the whole of the night, the whole of the year, the whole of 1800 years of becoming, had narrowed down to whether one quiet boy could see one true thing before a stone clock finished turning. He opened his eyes. He was not afraid. He had walled away fear in the 3rd year of his first decade and never gone back for it. But he understood, standing up in the cold ash, exactly how thin the night was, and he chose not to tell the others how thin, because frightening the brave one and the clever one would not make the lever come faster, and a captain who shares every number is not being honest, he is being weak, and Harry had not survived 18 centuries by confusing the 2. Right, he said, and his voice was steady, because he had spent the last of his steadiness on purpose on them. Let's go and break the unbreakable thing. I've never met a problem a long enough look couldn't crack, and we're about to have all the time in the world to look. They woke Ron because Harry had promised, and a promise was the one thing he owned that the room had never thought to take. He came down the dormitory stair pulling a jumper over his pajamas, blinking, cross, and then he saw the wreck of the common room, the cracked hearth, the scorched paneling, the chess pieces huddled white-faced under the sofas, and he stopped blinking and went very still, and to his enormous credit the first thing he said was not a question but a readiness. Right, he said, what do you need? Harry told him a true thing, the truest short version there was, because there was no time for the long one, and Ron had earned honesty if anyone had. There's a room under the castle that makes time run fast, and I've been using it all term, and it's killing something to pay for it, and tonight the bill came due, and there's a thing made out of a dead man coming to collect, and there's a worse thing, the thing that killed my parents, climbing up to steal the whole machine. I'm going down to break it. Hermione's coming because she's the only person alive who understands how it works. And you're coming because at some point tonight someone is going to need to do something brave that being clever can't do, and when that moment comes I want it to be you, and not because I'm managing you. Because you're the bravest person I know, and I'm going to need the bravest person I know, and I keep my promises. Ron Weasley looked at the wreckage and the weeping girl and his strange, quiet friend who had just said more in 30 seconds than he'd said all term, and his face did a complicated thing, fear and pride and the particular Weasley stubbornness that had nothing left to prove and everything left to give, and he said, My gran always said I'd come to a bad end following clever people into holes in the ground. He pulled the jumper straight. Lead on then, before I think about it. And Harry, hollowed of his mother, holding one grin behind one wall, found that he had the strength to do the thing he had not done in 1800 years, which was to grin back. The wall held, the grin came. It was the first proof he had that he had chosen the right thing to keep. He straightened. The swaying stopped by will, because will was the one thing the room had sharpened instead of taking. Below them, through the floor and the deep stone, the room breathed in and out with the hitch, and the disc turned toward the end of a turn it had begun the morning he walked out unbeatable, and something cold and patient and immortal climbed toward the gray light to claim it, and something cold and patient and ruined waited at the center to collect. We have until the disc finishes its turn, Harry said, and went to the gap behind the faded tapestry, and the gray light touched his hollowed face, and he did not crouch like a boy. I'd very much rather break it than pay it, and I have never once in 2 lifetimes met a problem that a long enough look couldn't crack, and the two of you are the only people I've ever met who look as hard as I do, the one with her mind and the one with his heart, so look hard, on the way down. Because down there an hour is 10 years, and we are about to have all the time in the world to think, and all the world's time to be wrong in, and a thing that cannot die waiting at the bottom of it, and a thing that will not stop climbing toward the top. He lifted the tapestry, and the room breathed out to meet him, cool and sweet, and underneath the sweetness. For the first time he tasted his mother's warmth on its breath, going down into the dark to be spent, and he went in after it, to the deep water, to the center, to the end of the turn, to settle, one way or another, the oldest debt in the school, with the brave one and the clever one at his back and a disc above him keeping honest time. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Master of time and magic. The room took the three of them the way a held breath takes a swimmer, and Harry felt the world above seal shut behind them, and the gray light closed over Ron and Hermione for the first time, and he watched two ordinary people meet the impossible and not break, and was proud of them in a way he had not had room to be proud of anyone in 1800 years. "It's so quiet," Hermione whispered. Her voice arrived a beat late, dragging through the thickened air, and she heard it and understood at once what the lateness meant and went pale and fascinated in equal measure. "We're inside it, we're inside the slope. Harry, every second we spend down here is longer than it is up there," Harry said. "I know, stay close to me, both of you. The slope deepens toward the center, and where we're going is the deep water, and I can hold the two of you at my own depth so we live the same minutes, but only if you stay close, and only if you do exactly what I say, and only," he added, because they had earned the truth and because the disc was already most of the way through its turn, "for as long as I last, which tonight is not forever." They crossed the spiral floor toward the pillar, and the warden was waiting at the center, exactly as it had promised, a worn gray shape standing over the disc where it had stood in one form or another for 500 years. And it was not alone. The cold thing had got there first. Professor Quirrell stood at the edge of the deep water with his turban unwound and his back to them. And when he turned, it was not Quirrell's frightened face that came around but the other one, the one on the back of his skull, the flat white face with the red eyes and the slits for a nose. The face Harry had carried in a green flash since he was a year old and never once let the room touch, and the face smiled because it had found, at the bottom of a castle it had come to rob, a thing infinitely more valuable than a stone. "Harry Potter," said Voldemort in the high cold voice, and the voice arrived through the thick air slow and terrible, every syllable a separate cold weight. "I came for a trinket that makes a body live forever, and I find this, a room where forever is cheap, where a careful man might take 10,000 years to perfect himself and step out having aged an afternoon." The red eyes moved over the gray light, the pillar, the disc, with a hunger Harry recognized because he had felt it himself on the first night. "How fortunate that the boy who has been hiding such a thing all term should bring me down to it, and bring me his clever friends besides, to serve as the first payments on my immortality. You have done me a service, Potter. You will do me a great many more, across a very long time." He did not know. Harry saw it at once, the one advantage the night had left him. Voldemort had felt the power and seen the room and understood the dilation, but he did not know the price. He did not know about the cord, the principle, the tenderness the machine ate, the collector that woke when the account ran dry. He thought he had found a free gift. He thought, the way Harry had not let himself think for 1 hour on the first night, that a room which handed out lifetimes had no giver and no bill. He was about to reach for it with both hands, the way Helena Ravenclaw had reached for it with both hands 1,000 years ago, meaning to seize it, and the room did not care what you meant. It cared what you touched. And the warden, standing over the disc, turned its ruined face from Harry to the white thing at the edge of the water, and Harry felt it weigh, felt the 500-year collector run its terrible arithmetic over a new and hungry thread that had just walked into the room intending to put its hands on the working. "Two debtors," the warden said in Berengar's worn lilt, almost to itself. "One who has spent 1800 years and cannot be held. And one who has touched nothing yet, but means to touch everything and could be held forever." Its scoured attention swung between them, the collection weighing which thread to hang the account on, and Harry understood that the whole night had narrowed to this. The machine wanted an anchor, and there were now two candidates in the deep water, and one of them was the thing that had murdered his parents and meant to live forever on the stolen tenderness of children. For one cold instant, and a cold instant in the deep water is a long and ample time to be tempted in. Harry saw the easy road, and let himself look at it, because a master looks at everything. He could do nothing. He could simply step back and let Voldemort reach for the room, and let the cold thing close its hands on the pillar with full greedy intent, and let the machine bind it, the way it had bound Helena, the way it had bound Berengar, anchor the whole 1,000-year debt to Lord Voldemort and hang him on the cord to pay it out across the rest of time. It would solve everything. It would save Hermione. It would end the threat that had hung over Harry's whole life. He had only to let the worst person in the world reach for the worst gift in the world and stand aside and let two horrors cancel. He looked at it for a long, ample, tempting instant, and then he set it down, because he had not spent 1800 years and his mother's warmth to become a person who solved his problems by feeding people to a machine that ate tenderness, however little tenderness this particular person had. The road that ran through letting the room take anyone, even this, was the road that ended in a worn gray face standing over a disc, and Harry had knelt over the name at the bottom of that road, and he was not going to walk it, not even to be rid of the thing he hated most in all the world. He was going to break the road instead. Hermione, he said low and fast, in the slow, ample time the deep water gave him. Listen, because I can only say this once and then it begins. You asked what touches a thing like this and doesn't get taken. You were right that there has to be something. I know what it is now. I've known since the common room, and I didn't want it to be true. He did not look at her. He was watching the warden weigh, watching Voldemort gather. The room runs on tenderness taken without consent. Every soul it bound by force or by theft or by catching them unaware. Your namesake reached to destroy it and got caught. Berengar reached to use it and got drained. It took my mother out of me while I held the door open by force. It has eaten stolen warmth for 1,000 years. It has never, not once, been given any, freely, with open eyes by someone who understood it completely and chose it anyway, because no one who understood it ever would. Harry, her voice cracked. She had got there, of course she had got there. She was the only person alive who could keep up. No, whatever you're about to do, no. A debt freely assumed in full by someone who understands it completely isn't transferred, Harry said. It's paid. That's the rule the Maker never wrote down because she couldn't imagine anyone doing it. She nearly did it herself. She chose her own death over spending her daughter. She paid her own price with open eyes, and it broke her running, but it came too late to free Helena. I can finish what she started. I'm the only one who can, because I'm the only debtor in 1,000 years who banked enough lived time to actually cover the principal. 1,800 years. That's not just skill, Hermione, it's time. Real time, the only currency this place respects, and I'm carrying more of it than anyone who has ever stood in this room, and it is exactly, almost exactly, the size of the bill. He stepped into the deep water, to the center, to the disc, and he put his hand on the pillar. He did it freely. That was the whole of the magic, and it was a magic the room had never been taught to recognize, because it had been built by the cleverest woman who ever lived to be proof against everything learned inside it, and this was not learned inside it. This was learned in the cold, on a stair, from a grieving ghost, with a friend's life on the table, the one thing the room never got to teach him, exactly as the old man at the bottom of the stair had said. He put his hand on the working with his eyes wide open and his understanding complete and his consent entire, and he said to the room, to the disc, to the 1,000-year cord and the worn gray collector and the white cold thing gathering itself to strike. I assume the debt, all of it. Helena Ravenclaw's principal, 1,000 years of it, the whole account. I take it onto myself freely, knowing exactly what it is, and I pay it in full now with what I'm carrying. Release her. And the room, which had no rule for a freely assumed debt, which had eaten only stolen things for 1,000 years, tried to do the only thing it knew how to do, which was to take, and found that it could not take what was being given, because giving is not taking's opposite that the machine could simply reverse. It is a different act entirely, one the Maker had armored the room against learning from the inside and never dreamed would walk in from the outside. The cord reaching to bind a new thread found the thread reaching back willingly into its own noose, and a noose that is embraced is not a noose, it is an embrace. The machine seized and stalled and began for the first time in 1,000 years to run backward. Harry poured the 18 centuries into the disc. It was the strangest sensation of 2 lives and the most enormous, and he had no walls for it and built none, because the point was not to keep it. He let the bank time go, the lived weight of 1,800 years, decade after decade, century after century, pouring out of him and into the pillar, into the cord, down the 1,000-year length of it to where a tired, translucent woman hung at the far end, spent to nothing, paying still. He felt it reach her. He felt the cord drawn thin to breaking after a millennium, fill not with stolen life this time, but with given time, freely given, a debt paid instead of a victim drained, and he felt the 1,000-year account come at last after 1,000 years to zero. The Grey Lady came apart, not into nothing, into release. Far off at the end of the cord, in the cold towers above, Helena Ravenclaw felt the weight she had carried for 1,000 years simply lift. The debt paid, the anchor unhooked, the long sentence served by another's free hand, and Harry, pouring his banked centuries into the disc, felt her turn after 1,000 years of hanging and look, and understand that someone had finally done the impossible arithmetic her mother could not, had found enough time and given it freely and bought her out. He felt her gratitude come back down the cord like warmth coming into a cold room, and it was the last gentle thing he would feel for a long time, and he kept it, the way he had kept Ron's grin, behind the one wall he had left, because it was a thing that could not be remade and was worth a wall. And the warden, standing over the disc, watched its account close. A collector exists to collect an open account. Close the account and the collector has no function, and the function was all the room had left of Berengar. except that it was not quite all because Harry had given it a taste of warmth in the common room and a man had stirred under the smoothness. And now the debt that had bound that man for 500 years was paid by a free hand in full, and the worn gray shape over the disc began to lose its scouring, began to remember in its last moments. The shape of the face it had signed beneath a tally on a sure first day. Paid, the warden said in Berenger's lilt, and the lilt was stronger now, a clever Welshman's voice coming back up out of 500 years of debt as the debt dissolved, in full, freely, after all this time. The ruined face looked at Harry with something that was, at the very last, almost a man's face, almost grateful, almost kind. I kept the count, do you understand, even at the end, even as it. I kept the count because I was waiting, 500 years, I was waiting, for someone clever enough and stubborn enough to settle it, so that I could stop. Thank you, boy. Thank you for being more stubborn than the cleverest woman who ever lived. And Berenger of the Long Hour, released from a function that no longer had an account to serve, came apart into the gray light he had been made of, and went finally, wherever the long dead go when the thing that held them lets go, and the deep water was emptier and cleaner for his leaving. And Lord Voldemort, who had watched all of this with growing fury, understanding none of it except that the boy was doing something that was using up the gift before he could seize it, struck. The cold came at Harry across the deep water with all the speed and malice of the most dangerous wizard the slow world had produced in a century, and in the slow world it would have been faster than sight, faster than thought, a killing thing arriving before its victim knew to fear it. In the deep water it crawled. This was Harry's home court, the one place in all the world where his advantage was not merely large but total, because here a second of the world was 10 years of lived time, and Harry lived at the bottom of the slope where it ran thinnest and fastest, and Voldemort, for all his power, was a guest in a house Harry had owned for 18 centuries. The killing curse came across the water, green and slow, dreamlike, a falling match, and Harry emptied of his banked time. Mortal now in a way he had not been an hour ago, but carrying still in his mind every edge he had found in 1800 years, because the mastery was his and the room had never been able to take it. Harry stepped out of its path with all the unhurried time in the world, and looked at the cold thing that had murdered his parents, and was not afraid. Because he had walled away fear in the third year of his first decade and never gone back for it. You don't understand the room, Harry said in the slow greenlit dark, and his voice was very calm, the calm the headmaster had let himself wander about on the first morning of term. You never did. You saw a thing that gives out lifetimes and you thought it was free. You reached for it with both hands, full of intent, meaning to seize it and own it and spend it forever. He moved through the slow water and the cold thing turned to follow him, far too slowly, a master of the quick world drowning in a place where quickness meant nothing. That's exactly how Helena Ravenclaw got bound to it for 1,000 years. You reach to take a thing that takes back. And an hour ago that would have been the worst thing that could happen to you and the best thing that could happen to me, and I could have stood aside and let it have you, and I thought about it, and I'm not going to because I just spent everything I had to teach this room that it doesn't get to eat people anymore. Not Helena, not Berenger, not Hermione, not even you. He could not kill Voldemort. He understood that even now, in the deep water, with all the power in the world, the cold thing was not wholly here, was anchored elsewhere by means Harry could feel but not yet name, a thread of its own running off into the world the way the room's cord had, and a thing anchored like that does not die when you destroy the part you can reach. But Harry was the master of this house, and a master does not need to kill an intruder. He needs only to put him out. So he did, and he did it with the whole of 18 centuries, no longer hidden, no longer careful, the full cosmic weight of everything he had become brought to bear for the first and last time in the one place it could be safely spent, and it was not a duel, because a duel requires two, and there was only one master in the deep water. Harry took the green light apart in the air with a turn of attention. He took the cold thing's grip on the Quirrell vessel apart the way he had learned to take things apart in the 2nd century and kept walled because it could unmake a person. And he unmade the binding gently, surgically, separating the parasite from the host it had ridden all term, and the host, freed and emptied and a year too late to be saved, fell away into the gray light, and the cold thing was suddenly only itself, a shade. A wisp of stolen wool with no body left to wear and no immortal room to flee into, because the immortal room had just closed its account forever and would never give a stolen lifetime to anyone again. The shade screamed, a high, thin, cold sound that crawled through the thick air, and it fled, because fleeing was all that was left to it, up out of the deep water and out of the room, and away into the world to find another body and another decade and another patient plan. And as it went, it passed close to Harry, close enough that the red eyes, guttering, dying, met the green ones, and Harry felt the cold thing see him, really see him, for the first time not as a famous orphan or a lucky boy, but as the thing he had spent all term hiding, a power that had stood in the one place it had the advantage, and used a god's strength to put Lord Voldemort out of a room like a cat. He felt it mark him. He felt it understand that the boy was not a boy, that there was something here that would have to be dealt with properly with care next time, and that there would be a next time because things like that always came back. He felt himself become, in the dying red eyes, a problem for the future. Let it come back, Harry thought, watching the shade flee up into the slow world. I'll be ready. I've had 1800 years to get ready, and the only thing I've lost tonight is the ability to get more, and I didn't need more. I never needed more. I needed exactly what I have, and now I know it. For a moment after the shade fled there was no sound at all, not even the breathing, and the three of them stood in the gray light in the wreckage of a 1,000-year machine, and Harry felt the deep water draining away around his ankles like a tide going out of a place it had owned since before there were people to name it. And then Helena Ravenclaw came down into the room one last time. She did not come up through the floor the way the warden had, or drift through the wall the way she had haunted the towers for 1,000 years. She came down the length of the cord that was no longer a cord that was paid out in slack and dissolving, a thread of cold silver unraveling into the gray light, and she came not as the tired, ruined ghost who had sat beside Harry on a cold stair, but as something nearer to the woman she had been before a proud, clever girl put her hands on her mother's pillar to break it. She was still translucent, she was still dead. But the weight had gone out of her, the 1,000-year weight, the drawn thin tension Harry had felt the first time he passed her on the marble stair, and what was left was only a woman, at last, only a daughter, freed of a sentence she had served for a crime that was only ever loving her mother too suspiciously and trusting her too little. "Paid," she said, and her voice was not the wind in an empty hall anymore. It was a voice, a person's voice, with something in it that had not been there in 1,000 years and took Harry a moment to recognize because he had not heard it from her before, and it was peace. In full, by a free hand, after all this time. She looked at the boy who had emptied 18 centuries into a disk to buy her out of the dark, and her face did a thing a ghost's face is not built to do, which was to be simply glad. "My mother could not free me. She was the cleverest woman who ever lived, and she could not do it, because she tried to do it from inside her own cleverness, with the same hands that built the trap. You did it from outside. You did it with a thing she never thought to guard against, which is a stranger's kindness given freely to a girl he never met, at a cost he understood completely and paid anyway." The peace in her face deepened towards something that was almost unbearable to look at. "Do you know what you are, Harry Potter? You are the thing my mother spent 40 years in an early grave hoping the world would someday make. You are proof that the trap was not the last word. I have waited 1,000 years to stop being the proof that it was." "Go," Harry said gently, because he had one wall left and behind it a friend's grin, and he could feel that this was a thing worth keeping too, this freeing, even if the room had taken the warmth he would have felt it with. "You've paid enough, more than enough. 1,000 years more than enough. Go and be wherever your mother is. Tell her." He stopped because he did not know what to tell a dead genius, and then he found it, the only thing worth sending across 1,000 years and the border of death. Tell her somebody finally finished her work. Not the work in the room, the other one, the one she chose her death to start. Helena Ravenclaw looked at him for one last held breath, the boy and the freed woman in the draining gray light, and then she smiled, and it was the smile her mother must have hoped to see on her the night before everything went wrong. And she let go of the unraveling cord and went up, not through the wall, not through the floor, but simply up and out and gone, the way a held breath goes when a body finally, after 1,000 years, remembers how to exhale. And the last thread of the cord dissolved into the gray light, and there was no one left in the room hanging on anything, for the first time in 1,000 years, and the place where Berenger of the Long Hour had stood for 5 centuries was empty and clean and at rest, and Harry thought he heard very far off going away, a clever man's voice in a worn Welsh lilt say, once "thank you" before it too was gone. Ron Weasley made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a brave boy makes when he has followed a clever person into a hole in the ground, and watched 2 impossible things fight a war and a third impossible thing get set free and a fourth flee screaming, and has understood perhaps a third of it, and has not run, has not once run, has stood in the angle of the wall where Harry put him, and been ready the entire time for the brave thing that being clever could not do, and has only now, in the after silence, been told by his own knees that he is 11 years old and a very long way underground. "Right," Ron said, when the sound had finished being a sound and become almost a word again. He was very pale, and he was still on his feet, and his wand was still in his hand, pointed at nothing now, at a room with nothing left in it to point at. "Right, so that's the room that you've been going to every morning before breakfast." He looked at the dead disc and the empty gray light and his strange quiet friend standing hollowed at the center of it. "And you gave it all up. The whole 1,800 years," Hermione said, 1,800 years, "and you poured it into a dead woman's daughter to let her stop hurting, and now you're going to be ordinary like the rest of us." He swallowed. "My gran was right. I have come to a bad end following clever people into holes in the ground. Worst night of my life. Absolute worst." And then, because he was Ron, because the bravery and the warmth were the same thing in him and always had been, he crossed the draining gray water to where Harry stood, and he put a hand on his friend's shoulder, clumsy, solid, alive, and he said, "Best one too, though. Don't tell anyone I said that. Are you all right? You look like you've seen, well, everything. You look like you've seen everything." "I have," Harry said. "That's exactly what I look like, because that's exactly what I've seen." And he found, with the one wall holding and the grin behind it, that he could put his own hand over Ron's, briefly, an ordinary boy's gesture that cost him nothing and was worth more than anything the room had ever charged him for, because it was witnessed by the two people in all the world he had chosen to be witnessed by, and a thing that is witnessed by the people you love does not have to wonder whether it is there. Hermione was crying without trying to stop, which for Hermione was a kind of surrender, and she was looking around the emptied room with the wide, wet, stunned eyes of a mind that has watched its largest theory proven and its dearest friend pay the whole price of the proof. "You broke it," she said, "from outside, in 1,000 years, with a thing she never armored against." She wiped her face with the back of the hand that still held her useless wand. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life knowing that's possible and never being able to tell anyone. That a debt freely assumed is a debt paid. That the only thing the cleverest woman who ever lived couldn't imagine was someone being kind to a stranger on purpose, all the way with their eyes open." She laughed, wet and broken and real. "It's the most important thing anyone will ever discover, and we can never publish it. That's going to drive me mad, Harry. That's going to drive me completely mad." "Manage," Harry said, and almost smiled, and the wall held and the almost smile came. "You're the only person I've ever met who could carry it. That's most of why I told you." The room was quiet. The disc had finished its turn, the turn it had begun the morning Harry walked out Unbeatable, and it had stopped because there was no longer an account for it to keep, and the gray light had gone soft and ordinary, the light of an empty room and not a hungry one. The breathing had stopped. The hitch was gone. Whatever the room had been for 1,000 years, it was not that anymore. It was only a round stone chamber under a castle with a dead clock at its center, and the deep water had gone shallow, and time in here ran very nearly the way it ran everywhere. Harry stood at the pillar, 11 years old, and took the measure of what he had paid, because measuring the cost was the discipline that had kept him whole, and he was not going to stop now at the end when it mattered most. He had given the room his 18 centuries, not the mastery was his, woven into his mind and his hand, the one thing the room had never been able to take and could not take now. He was still, and would always be, the most dangerous wizard the slow world contained, but the time was gone. The banked lifetimes poured into the disc to pay 1,000-year debt were spent, and the room was closed, and the door would never open for him again, because there was no longer a giver behind it and no longer a gift to give. He would not live a second life ever again. He would age now, 1 year per year, like everyone. He would have one human lifetime, and at the end of it he would die a human death, finite, ordinary, mortal, in the way he had stopped being on his first night at school when he found a door behind which a person could become anything. He had been, for 1,800 years, functionally a god of time, with all the time there was to spend. He had spent the last of it to buy a stranger's daughter out of a 1,000-year sentence, and now he was only a boy, a very, very powerful boy, with a single life to live at the world's slow pace, and his mother's warmth was still gone. He checked because he had to, because not checking was how you lied to yourself about what things cost, and the place where the green that was kindness had been was a clean-edged hole, exactly like the playground boy, and the freeing of Helena had not given it back, because the room did not give back, it only stopped taking, and a thing spent in the common room to save a girl's life stayed spent. He had paid that. He would carry the rest of his single mortal life. He stated it to himself once plainly, the way you say a true thing once so that you never have to pretend it isn't true. I gave up my mother's warmth in 18 centuries of time, and I would do it again, and it cost me everything it was supposed to cost, and that is what it means to pay. Then he set it down and turned to his friends and let it go, because one emotional reckoning was enough for any night, even a night that had lasted, down here, a great deal longer than a night. Ron and Hermione stood at the edge of the shallow water where he had held them safe at his own depth, and they were staring at him, and their faces held the thing he had spent all term making sure no one ever saw. They had watched Harry Potter be exactly what he was, with no hiding, and they had not run, and that, he understood, was the last gift of the night and the best one. Hermione was crying and furious and luminous with the size of what she had witnessed. Ron looked like a boy who had followed a clever person into a hole in the ground and found a god at the bottom of it and was going to need a while and was not going anywhere. "You're going to age now," Hermione said. She had worked it out, of course, like us. "You gave up the you'll only have one life. You could have kept it. You could have kept all of it, the room, the time, forever, and you poured it into a dead woman's daughter, and you're going to grow old and ordinary like the rest of us." She scrubbed at her face. "You absolute, you didn't even hesitate." "I hesitated for about a century in the deep water, learning how," Harry said. "But by the time my hand was on the pillar, no, I didn't hesitate." He looked around the quiet, ordinary room, the dead disc, the soft gray light. "I spent 1,800 years finding out that the only things worth having are the ones a machine like this can't give you and can only take. It gave me everything and charged me my mother for it." So I gave it everything back, and I bought a stranger her 1,000 years of rest, and I kept the two of you, and I kept Ron's grin behind the one wall I had left, and I think that's the best trade I ever made, and I've made some very good trades." He almost smiled. The wall held. The almost smile came. "I'm the master of this room now. Do you understand what that means?" "It means it's mine, and it's empty, and it will never hurt anyone again, because the only way to master a thing like this was to stop needing what it sold." They climbed up out of the room into the gray hour before dawn, and the castle was waking, and the wards Harry could feel were knitting themselves slowly back together now that nothing was bleeding them, the old protections settling back into the stone for the first time in a term. The third-floor corridor would be found in disarray. A stone would be safe or not, but that was the headmaster's problem, and Harry had a sense the headmaster had been managing that problem with one hand all term while watching Harry with the other. Quirrell would be found dead, emptied, and the story the slow world told about it would be wrong, and Harry would let it be wrong because some truths cost too much to tell and he had spent enough that night. Albus Dumbledore was waiting at the foot of the stair, because of course he was, an old man who had stood at the bottom of that stair 3 times in his life and watched 3 brilliant children come down broken, and who now watched a 4th come up. He did not ask what had happened. He looked at the 3 of them, at Ron, white and steady, at Hermione, wrecked and luminous, at Harry, hollowed and quiet and unmistakably, for the first time not hiding, and his ancient face did a thing Harry had not seen it do, which was to lose, briefly, its composure because the old man had spent a century preparing to fail a 5th time and was looking at the thing he had stopped letting himself hope for. "You broke it," Dumbledore said. It was not a question, and his voice was not entirely steady. "In 1,000 years, you broke it. I paid it," Harry said. "There's a difference, and it's the whole story, and I'll tell you all of it because you've earned it and because I'm tired of being the only one who carries things." He looked up at the old man in the gray light. "Helena's free, Berenger's free, the room's empty and closed and mine, and it will never take anyone again. And it cost me 1,800 years and my mother's warmth, and I'd like very much to not talk about the price right now because I've measured it once and that's enough." He paused. Voldemort was here, in the back of Quirrell's head all term. "He's a shade now, and he fled, and he saw me, really saw me, and he'll be back, and that's a problem for another day. I just thought you should know he's not gone. He's only waiting. He's good at waiting." "So am I." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The first child in 1,000 years he had not failed, and whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy something he had been carrying as long as the Grey Lady had carried her cord. "You have a first lesson in 2 hours, Mr. Potter," the old man said at last, gently, and there was something in it that was almost a benediction and almost a joke. "Transfiguration, I believe. Professor McGonagall does not accept tiredness as an excuse, and I would not advise telling her the true one." His eyes twinkled, damp and ancient and relieved. "Go and be ordinary, Harry. You have earned the right to it more than anyone I have ever met. And when you cannot be ordinary any longer, when the thing that fled tonight comes back, as it will, you will find that an old man at the bottom of a stair has been waiting a very long time to have, at last, a child he did not have to bury." He went to breakfast because the world went to breakfast, and he sat at the Gryffindor table between the brave one and the clever one, and he ate slowly at the world's pace, which was, now, simply his pace, because he had given away the part of him that ran faster than the world, and kept only the part that knew how. Ron told the story of the night to no one in particular, getting half of it wrong in ways that were better than the truth, and Hermione corrected the half that mattered and left wrong the half that didn't, and Harry watched the 2 of them and felt, behind his one wall, the grin he had paid his mother to keep, and found that it had been worth it, and that he would spend a single mortal lifetime being glad he had made the trade. He was still hiding. He understood that, eating his toast in the warm, slow roar of the great hall. He would always be hiding a little from the slow world, because the slow world was not ready to know that a thin, quiet boy at the back of the class had lived 1,800 years and could take the castle apart with a turn of attention, and telling it would help no one and frighten everyone and change nothing he wanted changed. He would hide from the world for the rest of his life, and he had made his peace with that on the first morning of term, and the peace held. But he was not hiding from himself anymore. That was the difference, and it was the whole difference, and it had cost 18 centuries and his mother's warmth to learn it. For one morning of his life, he had walked out of a gray room unbeatable, and spent the whole day terrified that the gulf between himself and everyone he loved would swallow the love along with everything else. And now he sat in the gulf, mortal again, finite again, aging again at one ordinary second per second, with a hole where his mother's warmth had been, and a wall around a friend's grin, and a 1,000-year debt paid in full at his back. And he was not terrified, because he had found, at the very bottom of the deep water, the one thing the room could never give and never take. He knew exactly what he was, and exactly what it had cost, and exactly what he had chosen to keep, and a person who knows that is not at the mercy of any room ever again. He was the master of time and magic, not because he had infinite time, he had given that away, not because his magic could break the world, it could, and he would never let it. He was the master because he had stood in the one place where time itself was for sale, with all of it in his hands, and he had looked at what it cost and what it was worth, and he had chosen, freely, with his eyes open, to spend the infinite to buy back the finite, the godhood to buy back the boy, the forever to buy one true mortal life with the two people he had emptied a whole house to keep. Far below the warm, slow hall, under the deep stone, a round gray room stood empty and quiet in its clock stopped, its debt paid, its long, cruel work finished forever. And somewhere out in the slow, cold world, a shade with red eyes fled toward whatever waited for it, carrying the memory of a green-eyed boy who had put it out of a room like a cat, and it remembered, and it waited, and it began patiently to plan. Let it plan, Harry thought, and reached for a second piece of toast, and let his hand not fumble it, because there was no one left at this table he needed to lie to. The wall held, the grin came. The morning light came down through the enchanted ceiling, slow and gold and ordinary, onto a boy who had all the time he needed, which was exactly one lifetime and not 1 hour more, and had finally, after 1800 years, learned that this was enough. Chapter 7 End.